Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a new descent into terror with 8 of the most disturbing true home invasion horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not fabricated tales or Hollywood fiction, but harrowing testimonies from real survivors whose sanctuaries became scenes of unimaginable dread. Each narrative reveals chilling encounters within the supposed safety of locked doors and familiar walls. From methodical intruders who studied their victims for months to encounters that defy logical explanation. The testimonies have been carefully preserved to maintain their raw authenticity, while certain names and locations have been altered to protect the privacy of those who endured these experiences. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss a single night when the darkness breaks down our defenses. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own home security experiences or which story left you checking your locks twice tonight. 2 weeks before everything went to hell, I found the first photograph wedged between the storm door and the main door of our farmhouse in rural Oregon. It was a Polaroid picture of me in my kitchen taken through the window while I was washing dishes, the timestamp showing it was from 3 nights earlier. I was 31, recently divorced, trying to rebuild my life with my 8-year-old daughter Sophie in the old farmhouse I had inherited from my grandmother. The property sat on 12 acres of Douglas fir and oak, isolated enough that our nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the gravel road. I should have called the police immediately, but I convinced myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe one of the teenagers from town had driven out here on a dare. The divorce had been messy, and I wondered if my ex-husband was trying to intimidate me somehow, though photography was never his style. I showed the picture to my sister when she came to visit that weekend, and she insisted I report it. But when Deputy Martinez came by Monday afternoon, he seemed more concerned about my mental state than any potential threat. "Ma'am, you've been under a lot of stress with the divorce and moving out here," he said, turning the Polaroid over in his hands. "Could be someone just passing through thought it was funny. I'll increase patrols in the area, but unless something else happens, there's not much we can do." Something else did happen. 3 nights later, I woke up around 2 in the morning to Sophie shaking me. She was standing next to my bed in her pink unicorn pajamas, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the curtains. "Mama, there's a man outside my window," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was looking at me while I was sleeping." My blood turned to ice. Sophie's bedroom was on the 2nd floor. To look in her window, someone would need a ladder or would have to climb the old oak tree whose branches reached toward that side of the house. I grabbed the baseball bat I had started keeping beside my bed and told Sophie to stay behind me as we crept down the hallway. Her room faced the back of the property, toward the woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I peered through her window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The motion sensor light I had installed the week before illuminated the backyard in harsh white light, but I could see nothing unusual. The tree branches swayed gently in the October wind, casting moving shadows across the grass. I checked the window lock twice, then moved to the other upstairs windows looking for any sign of disturbance. Everything appeared normal. "Maybe it was just a dream, sweetheart," I told Sophie, though I did not believe it myself. She was a practical child, not given to nightmares or wild imagination. "It wasn't a dream, Mama." He had a camera. The flash woke me up, and when I opened my eyes, he was taking pictures of me sleeping. That detail made my stomach clench, with fear and disgust. I called 911 immediately, but by the time the deputy arrived 45 minutes later, there was nothing to see. He walked the perimeter of the house with his flashlight, checked the ground beneath Sophie's window for footprints, but the dry autumn leaves revealed nothing conclusive. I'm going to recommend you install a security system, Deputy Martinez said before leaving. And maybe consider staying with family for a few days while we investigate. But I had spent every dollar I had on attorney fees during the divorce. A security system was not in my budget, and I refused to be driven from my home by some pervert with a camera. I moved Sophie into my bedroom that night, pushing her twin bed against the wall next to mine. We would sleep together until I figured out what to do. The photographs continued appearing. One showed me walking to my car in the morning, coffee mug in hand, taken from somewhere in the tree line. Another captured me folding laundry in the living room, shot through the front window. Each one was dated and time-stamped, creating a chronological record of my daily routine. Someone was watching us, learning our patterns, documenting our lives with methodical precision. I started varying my schedule, leaving for work at different times, taking different routes home. I bought thick curtains for every window and kept them drawn even during the day. The house felt like a cave, but at least whoever was out there could not see inside anymore. Sophie stopped playing in the backyard, and I could see the stress affecting her. She was jumpy, had trouble sleeping, and her teacher called to express concern about her distraction in class. 2 weeks after the first photograph appeared, I found something that made me physically sick. Taped to the inside of my mailbox was a manila envelope containing dozens of Polaroids. Pictures of me getting dressed in my bedroom, taken from a position that would have required someone to be in the old oak tree outside my window. Images of Sophie playing in her room, completely unaware she was being watched. Photos of us sleeping, the camera flash somehow not waking either of us. But the most disturbing images were of the inside of our house, taken when we were not home. Someone had been inside, photographing our personal belongings, our family pictures, even the contents of our refrigerator. In one image, they had arranged some of Sophie's toys in a disturbing tableau on her bedroom floor. In another, they had moved items around in my dresser drawer, creating patterns that I had not noticed when I got dressed that morning. The timestamps on these interior photographs spanned several weeks. This person had been coming into our home repeatedly, moving through our spaces while we slept or while we were away. They had been watching us, studying us, documenting every aspect of our lives for reasons I could not comprehend. I called the police again, but Deputy Martinez was off duty. The officer who came to take the report seemed more competent, Detective Sarah Chen from the County Sheriff's Department. She examined each photograph carefully, noting the timestamps and angles. "This person has been stalking you for at least a month," she said. "The fact that they have interior photographs means they have been inside your home. We need to process this as a breaking and entering case, possibly burglary, and definitely stalking." She arranged for a forensics team to dust for fingerprints, though she warned me that most stalkers are careful enough to wear gloves. They found evidence of tampering with the lock on the back door, scratches on the metal that suggested someone had picked it. Detective Chen recommended I change all the locks immediately and consider installing a security system, even a basic one. That night, Sophie and I stayed at my sister's house in town. While we were gone, Detective Chen positioned surveillance equipment around the property. Hidden cameras with night vision capability, motion sensors linked directly to the sheriff's department, and an officer parked in an unmarked car at the end of our driveway. The trap worked faster than anyone expected. Around midnight, the motion sensors triggered and the cameras captured clear footage of a man approaching the house. He was wearing dark clothing and a ski mask, carrying a camera and what appeared to be a lockpick set. When he reached the back door and began working on the lock, 3 deputies emerged from their hiding positions and surrounded him. The man they arrested was someone I had never seen before, a drifter named Curtis Dalton, who had been camping in the national forest land adjacent to our property. He had been living in a makeshift shelter about 2 miles into the woods, surviving by stealing from isolated farmhouses and cabins in the area. Our house had become his obsession because, as he told detectives during questioning, he liked watching families, particularly mothers and daughters. In his camp, they found hundreds more photographs, not just of Sophie and me, but of other families throughout the county. He had detailed notebooks documenting the daily routines of his subjects, maps showing the layouts of various homes, and disturbing writings that revealed his increasing fantasies about the people he stalked. Detective Chen later told me that I was lucky we caught him when we did, because his writing suggested he was escalating toward more direct contact. Curtis Dalton had been living beneath our property for almost 3 months, entering our home at least twice a week whenever we were asleep or away. He knew Sophie's school schedule, my work routine, even when my sister visited. He had been planning something more invasive, Detective Chen explained, though she would not give me the specific details of what they found in his notebooks. The most disturbing revelation came during his psychological evaluation. Dalton told the court, psychiatrist, that he had done this before, in Washington State and Northern California, always targeting isolated rural homes with single mothers and children. He would study a family for months, document their lives obsessively, then disappear and move on to the next target. We were just the latest in a pattern that had been going on for years. Sophie and I moved back to town after that. I could not live in that house anymore, knowing that someone had been watching us sleep, moving through our rooms while we were unconscious, studying us like specimens in a laboratory. We found a small apartment above a bakery on Main Street, where the sounds of traffic and other people felt comforting instead of intrusive. Curtis Dalton pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including stalking, breaking and entering, and possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Detective Chen warned me that people like him rarely reform. When he gets out, he will likely start over somewhere else, finding new families to terrorize with his camera and his twisted need to invade their privacy. Even now, 2 years later, I check every window lock twice before bed and keep curtains drawn at all times. Sophie still sleeps in my room some nights, especially when she has nightmares about the man with the camera. We both flinch when we hear unexpected sounds at night, and I find myself constantly scanning crowds and parking lots, looking for anyone who might be watching us too closely. The worst part is knowing that for months, our most private moments were not private at all. Someone was always watching, always documenting, always there in the shadows with his camera and his notebooks. That sense of violation never completely goes away. The knowledge that our safety was an illusion, and our home was never really ours at all. My name is Mia, and I was 23 when I agreed to house sit for Professor Whitmore during his sabbatical in England. The Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts had been in his family for generations, a 3-story monument to New England Gothic architecture with bay windows, ornate woodwork, and the kind of creaking floors that announced your presence to every room in the house. As a graduate student in art history, I was grateful for the opportunity to live rent-free in exchange for basic maintenance and keeping an eye on his extensive collection of rare books and artifacts. Professor Whitmore had been my advisor for 2 years, a distinguished man in his 70s who specialized in colonial American religious art. His house reflected his academic interests, filled with Puritan-era furniture, religious paintings from the 17th century, and glass cases containing artifacts from Salem's witch trial period. He assured me the house was perfectly safe, though he mentioned that previous house-sitters had sometimes reported odd sounds at night, which he attributed to the building's age and the New England weather. I moved in on a gray October afternoon as the last leaves were falling from the ancient oak trees that surrounded the property. The house felt immediately oppressive, not because of any supernatural atmosphere, but simply because of its size and the weight of history contained within its walls. Every room was filled with dark, heavy furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced colonists who seemed to watch me as I walked past. The first week passed without incident. I established a routine of studying in the library during the day, preparing simple meals in the kitchen that had been modernized but retained its period character, and spending evenings reading in the sitting room beside the original fireplace. The isolation was peaceful after the chaos of graduate school, and I was making excellent progress on my thesis about religious symbolism in early American art. The shadows started moving during my second week in the house. At first, I attributed the phenomenon to the changing angle of sunlight through the tall windows as autumn progressed. The house had dozens of windows, many with irregular glass that had been in place for over a century, and the way light filtered through them created complex patterns on the walls and floors throughout the day. But these shadows were different. They moved independently of any light source, sliding along the walls like dark stains spreading across fabric. I first noticed them in my peripheral vision while reading in the library, dark shapes that seemed to detach themselves from corners and glide across the room before disappearing behind furniture or into doorways. When I turned to look directly at them, they were never there, but I could feel their presence, a sensation like being watched by something that remained just outside the range of vision. The temperature in whatever room I occupied would drop several degrees, and I found myself constantly reaching for sweaters and closing windows that I had not remembered opening. Professor Whitmore had left detailed instructions for maintaining the house, including a list of quirks and maintenance issues that had developed over the decades. He mentioned that some of the interior doors had a tendency to swing open on their own due to settling in the foundation, and that the third floor sometimes produced sounds like footsteps when the wind was strong. I tried to rationalize the shadow movements as similar phenomena, tricks of an old house that I would learn to ignore with time. But the shadows grew bolder during my third week. They began appearing during daylight hours, darker and more substantial than before, moving with purpose rather than the random drifting I had initially observed. They seemed to be learning the layout of the house, following the same paths repeatedly, as if tracing routes between rooms for reasons I could not understand. One afternoon, while organizing Professor Whitmore's papers in his study, I watched a shadow detach itself from the bookshelf behind his desk and move directly toward me. It was roughly human-shaped but without distinct features, a patch of absolute darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. When it reached the edge of my desk, it stopped, and I felt a presence hovering just beyond my shoulder, as if something was reading over my arm. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke whatever was manifesting in the room with me. After several minutes, the shadow retreated, sliding backward along the same path until it merged with the darkness behind the bookshelf and disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly that I could not continue working, and I spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen with all the lights on, trying to convince myself that stress and isolation were causing hallucinations. That night, I called my roommate from graduate school, desperate for normal human conversation and some perspective on what I was experiencing. Sarah listened patiently as I described the moving shadows, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice as she suggested I was working too hard and spending too much time alone in an old house that was probably full of mice and settling sounds. But as we talked, I watched a shadow move across the kitchen wall behind me, visible in the reflection of the window above the sink. It paused when it reached the edge of the window frame, and I had the distinct impression that it was listening to my conversation. When Sarah asked if I was still there, I realized I had stopped talking mid-sentence, transfixed by the sight of something that should not exist, eavesdropping on my phone call. The shadows became more aggressive during my 4th week in the house. Instead of simply moving through rooms, they began interacting with objects, though never when I was looking directly at them. I would hear books falling in the library, and when I investigated, I would find volumes scattered on the floor beneath empty spaces on the shelves. Papers on Professor Whitmore's desk would be rearranged into neat piles overnight, organized by some system I could not determine. Most disturbing were the changes to the religious artifacts throughout the house. Crucifixes would be found turned upside down, prayer books open to specific passages that dealt with spiritual warfare and demonic possession, and the glass cases containing Puritan-era religious items would be found with their locks undone and contents rearranged. Whatever presence inhabited the house was demonstrating knowledge of religious symbolism, and seemed to be making deliberate theological statements through its manipulations. I began researching the history of the house and the Whitmore family, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. The house had been built in 1692, the same year as the Salem witch trials, by a Puritan minister named Ezra Whitmore, who had been instrumental in the prosecution of accused witches. Several women had been interrogated in the house before their trials, and at least 3 had died in the basement while awaiting transportation to the courthouse. Professor Whitmore was a direct descendant of Ezra Whitmore, and the house had remained in the family for over 3 centuries. Previous generations had reported similar phenomena, particularly during times when the house was occupied by single individuals rather than families. The shadows seemed to manifest most strongly when the house contained only one living person, as if they fed on isolation and solitude. During my 5th week, the shadows began appearing in my dreams. I would find myself walking through the house at night, following dark figures that led me through rooms I had never seen before, down hallways that did not exist in the actual layout of the building. In these dreams, the shadows had voices, whispering in languages I could not understand but somehow knew were accusations and condemnations. I began waking up in different parts of the house from where I had gone to sleep, sometimes finding myself standing in the library or the basement with no memory of how I had gotten there. The sleepwalking episodes left me exhausted and disoriented, and I started setting alarms throughout the night to prevent myself from wandering unconsciously through the building. The climax came during a thunderstorm in early November. I was reading in the sitting room when the power failed, leaving me in complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the darkness was not empty. Shadows moved throughout the room, dozens of them, more than I had ever seen before, all converging toward my chair. They surrounded me in a circle, and in the intermittent lightning I could see that they had developed more distinct shapes. They resembled human figures in colonial dress, men and women in the dark clothing of Puritan New England, but their faces were voids of absolute blackness that seemed to pull light out of the air around them. One of them spoke, its voice like wind through dry leaves, accusing me of trespassing on sacred ground, of disturbing the peace of those who had died unjustly within these walls. The others joined in, their voices creating a chorus of condemnation that filled the room with words I could understand despite their archaic language and accusatory tone. They told me they were the spirits of women who had been tortured and killed in the house, innocent victims of Ezra Whitmore's religious fanaticism, who had never found peace after their deaths. They had been trapped in the building for centuries, their anger growing stronger with each generation of Whitmores who profited from the legacy of their persecution. The shadows reached toward me, and I felt cold fingers touching my skin, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me into their circle. I screamed and ran from the room, crashing through the hallway in complete darkness, falling up the stairs and locking myself in the bedroom I had been using on the 2nd floor. I called Professor Whitmore in England, despite the time difference and the expense of the international call. When I described what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he admitted that the house had a history of supernatural activity that he had not mentioned because previous house sitters had always left before experiencing anything significant. He arranged for me to stay in a hotel for the remainder of his sabbatical and hired a professional house-sitting service to maintain the property. When I returned to collect my belongings the next day, accompanied by 2 friends from graduate school, we found that every religious artifact in the house had been destroyed. Crucifixes had been snapped in half, prayer books had been torn to pieces, and the glass cases had been shattered from the inside. The shadows were gone, as if their destruction of the religious items had finally allowed them to find the peace they had been seeking for 3 centuries. But the house felt different, emptier, like a building whose purpose had finally been fulfilled. I never completed my thesis on religious symbolism in colonial American art. The experience in Professor Whitmore's house had given me a perspective on the intersection of religion and supernatural phenomena that I was not prepared to explore academically. I changed my focus to modern art and avoided any subject matter that dealt with historical religious persecution. Professor Whitmore sold the house when he returned from England and donated his artifact collection to the Peabody Essex Museum. He never explained his decision to liquidate a family legacy that had been maintained for over 3 centuries, but I suspect he finally understood that some historical injustices create debts that can never be fully repaid. Sometimes I wonder if the shadows found peace after their final act of destruction, or if they simply moved on to haunt other places connected to their persecution. The Salem area has many buildings with similar histories, and I have heard stories from other graduate students about supernatural encounters in colonial-era houses throughout New England. But I stay away from old houses now, particularly those with connections to the witch trials or other episodes of religious persecution. Some historical research requires a level of personal risk that extends far beyond academic curiosity, and I learned that some stories are better left undisturbed. The cabin belonged to my grandfather, tucked away in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, where the nearest road turned to dirt 20 miles back and cell phone service died somewhere around mile 15. My name is Brian, and I had invited 3 friends to join me for what was supposed to be a long weekend of hunting and drinking, far from jobs and responsibilities and the endless noise of modern life. The cabin had been in my family for 40 years, and I had been making these trips since college without incident. Marcus, Trevor, and Kyle arrived Friday afternoon just as the October sky began to dim with the promise of an early winter. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove, propane appliances, and enough space for 4 grown men who did not mind sleeping in bunk beds like teenagers at summer camp. We had brought enough food and beer for a week, though we only planned to stay until Monday morning. The first night passed without incident. We stayed up late playing cards, drinking whiskey, and sharing stories about failed relationships and workplace frustrations. The isolation felt therapeutic after months of urban stress, and when we finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the occasional call of an owl somewhere in the darkness beyond our windows. Saturday morning, we split up to hunt. Marcus and Trevor headed north toward the creek that ran through the valley, while Kyle and I took the southern ridge where my grandfather had always claimed the deer were more plentiful. We agreed to meet back at the cabin by sunset, a rule my grandfather had drilled into me from childhood. The mountains could be unforgiving to anyone caught out after dark, especially when the weather turned. Kyle and I returned first around 5:30, empty-handed but satisfied with a day in the woods. We started a fire and began preparing dinner, expecting Marcus and Trevor to arrive within the hour. When 6:30 came and went without sign of them, we began to worry. By 7:30, with full darkness settling over the mountains and the temperature dropping toward freezing, Kyle suggested we take flashlights and head out to look for them. We had been searching for maybe 20 minutes when we heard Marcus calling from somewhere to the east of the cabin. His voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, calling our names and asking for help. Kyle and I exchanged glances and immediately headed in that direction, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness between the trees. "Marcus, where are you?" I called back, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Over here by the big pine," came his response, though the direction seemed wrong. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, farther from where Marcus and Trevor should have been hunting. We pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at our jackets, following the sound of Marcus's voice. But something felt wrong. The voice was calling from different directions, first to our left, then ahead of us, then behind us, as if Marcus was moving rapidly through the forest in patterns that made no sense. "Marcus, stay where you are," Kyle shouted. "We are coming to you." "Stop moving around," the voice called back, agreeing to stay put, but within minutes we heard it again from a completely different location. This continued for almost an hour, with us stumbling through the darkness, following a voice that seemed to be leading us in circles, always just out of reach. Kyle was the first to voice what we were both thinking. "That does not sound exactly like Marcus," he said, stopping to catch his breath against a boulder. "The words are right, but something about the voice is off." I had been thinking the same thing, though I could not articulate what was wrong. The voice had Marcus's tone and inflection, but there was something artificial about it, like a recording being played back rather than actual speech. And there was the matter of how quickly it moved from place to place, covering ground that would have been impossible for a person on foot. We decided to return to the cabin and wait. If Marcus and Trevor were lost, they knew the area well enough to follow the creek back to familiar landmarks. If they were injured, we would organize a proper search party in the morning with help from the Forest Service. Stumbling around in the dark was not helping anyone. Back at the cabin, we built up the fire and waited. Around 10 o'clock, we heard Trevor's voice calling from the direction of the front door. Kyle immediately went to let him in, but when he opened the door, no one was there. The porch was empty, our motion sensor light illuminating nothing but falling leaves and the beginning of snow flurries. "Trevor!" Kyle called into the darkness. "I am here," came Trevor's voice, but it was coming from behind the cabin now, near the woodshed. Kyle grabbed his flashlight and circled the building, but found nothing. For the next 3 hours, we were subjected to a methodical psychological assault. The voices of our missing friends called to us from every direction, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes engaging in normal conversation as if nothing was wrong. The voices knew details that only Marcus and Trevor would know, referencing shared memories and using inside jokes that should have been impossible for anyone else to duplicate. Around 1 in the morning, both voices began calling simultaneously from opposite sides of the cabin. Marcus's voice from the north side, Trevor's from the south, both asking us to come outside and help them with something. The conversations overlapped and intertwined, creating an impossible dialogue between two people who claimed to be in different locations. Kyle had barricaded the door with a chair and was sitting with his hunting rifle across his knees. I kept moving between windows, trying to catch sight of whatever was out there. But the darkness beyond our lights revealed nothing. The voices continued their calls, growing more insistent, more desperate, begging us to come outside and help them. "They are hurt," Trevor's voice pleaded. "Marcus is bleeding. I cannot carry him alone." "The thing got Trevor," Marcus's voice called from the other direction. "I think it broke his leg. I need help getting him back to the cabin." The contradictory stories should have made it obvious that something was wrong, but the voices were so convincing, so perfectly matched to our friends, That part of me wondered if they were both injured and confused, calling out in delirium without understanding what they were saying. Around 3 in the morning, the voices changed tactics. Instead of pleading for help, they began engaging us in normal conversation, as if they were sitting around the campfire with us. Marcus's voice told the story about the time he got arrested in college for streaking through the library during finals week. Trevor's voice described his recent breakup with his girlfriend, using the exact words he had used when he told us about it the previous evening. The conversations felt so natural that Kyle actually responded a few times before catching himself. It was Marcus's voice telling a funny story about his new job, and Kyle laughed and made a comment as if we were all sitting together in the same room. The normalization of the situation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. As dawn approached, the voices began to fade. The last thing we heard was both voices saying goodbye, thanking us for a great weekend and promising to see us soon. Then silence fell over the mountains, broken only by the wind and the crackling of our dying fire. Kyle and I sat in stunned silence as gray morning light filtered through the windows. We had not slept, had barely eaten, and neither of us was entirely sure what we had experienced during the night. In the daylight, the whole thing seemed impossible, like a shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Around 8 in the morning, we heard a vehicle approaching the cabin. Looking out the window, I saw Marcus's truck coming up the dirt road, bouncing over the ruts and rocks that marked the final approach to the cabin. Both Marcus and Trevor were visible in the front seat, apparently unharmed. They climbed out of the truck looking tired but normal, carrying their hunting gear and talking about the deer they had seen but failed to get a clean shot at. When Kyle and I rushed outside to greet them, they looked at us with confusion and concern. "You guys look terrible," Marcus said. "Did you get any sleep last night?" When we explained what had happened, describing the voices calling to us throughout the night, both men insisted they had been miles away. They had made camp near the creek, they said, and had spent the night around their own fire, sharing a bottle of bourbon and talking about old times. They had heard nothing unusual and had certainly not called out to us or approached the cabin during the night. Trevor showed us photographs on his phone, time-stamped images of their campsite and the fire they had built. The metadata confirmed they had been taken throughout the previous evening and night, miles from the cabin. There was no way they could have been the source of the voices Kyle and I had heard, but the voices had known things that only Marcus and Trevor could know. Personal details, shared experiences, private jokes that had never been written down or recorded anywhere. Whatever had been calling to us during the night had somehow accessed information that should have been impossible to obtain. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our trip short by a day. None of us talked much during the drive back to civilization, and we have never returned to the cabin together since that weekend. Marcus and Trevor seemed to accept our story, but I could tell they thought Kyle and I had experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and stress. Kyle and I have discussed that night many times over the years since, trying to make sense of what we experienced. We have considered every rational explanation, from psychological stress to environmental factors to elaborate pranks orchestrated by strangers. None of the explanations fit the facts as we experienced them. The voices were too perfect, too accurate in their mimicry. They knew details that no outsider could have known, and they sustained complex conversations for hours without making any mistakes in character or tone. Whatever intelligence was behind those voices had somehow acquired intimate knowledge of our relationships and personal histories. I sold the cabin 2 years later. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed threatening, and I could not shake the feeling that something was still out there in those woods, watching and waiting and learning to imitate the voices of anyone who might venture too far from safety. The official explanation, if anyone bothered to investigate, would probably involve altitude sickness, stress hallucinations, or some other psychological phenomenon that affects people in extreme isolation. But Kyle and I know what we heard that night, and we know it was not human. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus and Trevor remember that weekend differently than they claim. Sometimes I catch them looking at Kyle and me with expressions I cannot quite read, as if they are trying to decide whether we can be trusted with some secret they carry. But then the moment passes, and they are just our friends again, ordinary people living ordinary lives. The mountains keep their secrets, and whatever called to us that night using the voices of our friends remains out there in the wilderness, patient and intelligent and utterly inhuman. My name is Eric, and I moved to Dallas, Texas in September 2019 for a software engineering position at a tech startup downtown. After years of cramped apartments and unreliable roommates, I was finally earning enough to afford my own place. I found a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Meadowbrook, complete with a front porch, a small backyard, and neighbors who seemed normal from the brief interactions I had during my house hunting visits. The neighborhood felt like something from a 1950s television show, with neat lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of tree-lined streets where children rode bicycles and parents walked dogs at predictable times. After the chaos of urban apartment living, the suburbanite routine felt comforting and safe. The first month passed without incident. I established a work-from-home routine in the spare bedroom I had converted into an office, ordered furniture online, and began the slow process of turning an empty house into something that felt like home. My neighbors were polite but distant, offering waves from their driveways and occasional comments about the weather when we encountered each other while collecting mail or taking out trash. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived directly across the street, was the exception. She made a point of introducing herself during my first week and brought me a casserole along with a detailed explanation of the neighborhood dynamics. She mentioned the Johnsons on the corner who traveled frequently for work, the young couple next door who had recently married and kept late hours, and various other details about local residents that I politely acknowledged but did not particularly need to know. It was Mrs. Patterson who first mentioned the smiling man during our third conversation, which took place while I was attempting to repair my sprinkler system on a Saturday morning in October. "You should be careful about that fellow who has been asking about you," she said, approaching my front yard with a concerned expression and a coffee mug in her hands. I stopped wrestling with the sprinkler head and looked up at her. "What fellow?" "Tall man, maybe 40 years old, always wearing a nice suit even during the day. He has been walking through the neighborhood for the past week asking questions about the new resident. That would be you, I suppose." She described a man who claimed to be conducting a survey for the city planning department, asking detailed questions about my schedule, my work habits, whether I lived alone, and what kind of security system I might have installed. He carried a clipboard and wore an official-looking badge which had convinced several neighbors to provide information they probably should not have shared with a stranger. "The thing that bothered me was his smile," Mrs. Patterson continued. "It never changed, no matter what anyone said to him. Just this wide, fixed smile that did not reach his eyes made me uncomfortable, so I told him I did not have time for surveys." I thanked her for the warning, but did not think much of it initially. Door-to-door salespeople and survey takers were common enough, and I assumed this man was legitimate but perhaps overly persistent in his approach. I made a mental note to be polite but brief if he approached me directly. The man appeared at my front door the following Tuesday evening while I was eating dinner. Through the peephole, I could see exactly what Mrs. Patterson had described: a tall man in an expensive-looking dark suit holding a clipboard, wearing an identification badge, and displaying a smile so wide and rigid that it looked painful to maintain. When I opened the door, his smile somehow became even broader, revealing teeth that were unnaturally white and perfectly straight, like something from a dental advertisement. "Good evening," he said, his voice pleasant but somehow artificial, like a recording of someone trying to sound friendly. "My name is David Crawford, and I am conducting a neighborhood satisfaction survey for the Dallas City Planning Department. I understand you are the new resident at this address." His questions were innocuous enough initially. How long had I lived in the house? Was I satisfied with city services? Did I feel safe in the neighborhood? But gradually the inquiries became more personal and specific. What time did I typically leave for work? Did I work from home often? Had I installed any security cameras or alarm systems? Throughout the conversation, which lasted perhaps 15 minutes, his smile never wavered. Not when I mentioned I worked in software engineering, not when I declined to provide specifics about my schedule, not even when I politely indicated that I needed to return to my dinner. The smile remained fixed, unnatural, and increasingly disturbing as I realized it did not correspond to anything happening in our conversation. When I finally closed the door, I watched through the window as he walked to the sidewalk. Instead of proceeding to the next house, he stood at the end of my driveway for several minutes, looking back at my house with that same unwavering smile before finally disappearing around the corner. The next morning, I called the Dallas City Planning Department to verify David Crawford's credentials. After being transferred between several departments, I spoke with a supervisor who confirmed that the city was not conducting any neighborhood satisfaction surveys in my area. There was no employee named David Crawford in their system, and they advised me to report any suspicious individuals claiming to represent the city to the local police. I filed a report with the non-emergency line, providing the physical description Mrs. Patterson and I had developed. The officer who took my information said they had received similar reports from other neighborhoods throughout the past month. Someone was impersonating a city employee to gather information about residents, though his ultimate purpose remained unclear. Over the following weeks, I began noticing signs that someone was observing my house and monitoring my routine. My newspaper would be moved from where the delivery person typically placed it. Items in my mailbox would be slightly rearranged, as if someone had examined my mail before replacing it. Most disturbing, I found footprints in the flower bed beneath my bedroom window, fresh impressions in the soft soil that appeared overnight and matched the size and pattern of dress shoes. I installed security cameras around the perimeter of my property, positioning them to cover all approaches to the house as well as the front and back doors. The system included night vision capability and motion-activated recording, with alerts sent directly to my phone whenever movement was detected. The cameras captured him within 3 days. David Crawford, still wearing his dark suit and maintaining that horrifying smile, appeared in my backyard at 2:47 in the morning. He walked slowly around the house, peering into windows, testing door handles, and at one point standing directly beneath my bedroom window for nearly 20 minutes. Looking up at the glass with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Most disturbing was his behavior when he noticed the cameras. Instead of fleeing or attempting to avoid detection, he walked directly up to each camera, stood close enough that his face filled the frame, and smiled even more broadly while staring directly into the lens. He remained motionless for several minutes at each camera location, as if posing for photographs before moving to the next one. I called the police immediately, but by the time officers arrived, David Crawford had vanished. The responding officers reviewed the camera footage and agreed that his behavior was highly suspicious and potentially dangerous. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and advised me to document any further incidents. The harassment escalated dramatically the following week. I began receiving phone calls at all hours, sometimes 15 or 20 per night, from numbers that showed up as unavailable or blocked. When I answered, I would hear silence for several seconds, followed by what sounded like quiet laughter before the line went dead. More disturbing were the packages that began appearing on my porch. Small boxes wrapped in brown paper containing items that should not have been available to anyone outside my home. Photographs of my kitchen taken from inside the house, a photocopy of a personal letter I had written but not yet mailed, a small piece of fabric that I recognized as coming from a shirt in my laundry hamper. Each package included a handwritten note in precise, careful handwriting. The messages were variations on the same theme, expressions of admiration for my lifestyle, comments about how happy I appeared to be, and suggestions that happiness was something that could be shared or collected or transferred from one person to another. The final note was different. Instead of the usual observations about my happiness, it contained a detailed schedule of my activities for the previous week. When I had left the house, where I had gone, how long I had been away, even what I had eaten for dinner on specific nights. Someone had been watching me constantly, documenting every aspect of my routine with obsessive precision. The climax came on a Thursday night in November when my motion sensors triggered at 3:15 in the morning. Instead of checking the camera app on my phone, I got up to look out my bedroom window directly. David Crawford was standing in my backyard, still wearing his suit, still maintaining that terrible smile. But this time he was holding something in his hands. As I watched, he began taking photographs of my house with a professional-looking camera, using a flash that illuminated the entire yard in harsh white light. But he was not photographing the building itself. He was taking pictures of the windows, specifically the windows behind which I was standing, as if he could see me watching him. After several minutes of photography, he walked to my back door and began working on the lock with what appeared to be professional lock-picking tools. I called 911 immediately and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door and grabbing a baseball bat from my closet. The police arrived within 6 minutes, but David Crawford was gone by then. However, this time he had left behind evidence. The lock-picking tools were scattered on my back porch along with the camera and dozens of printed photographs. The images showed not just my house, but the houses of at least a dozen other people throughout the Dallas area, all taken from inside their properties during what appeared to be nighttime break-ins. Detective Maria Santos, who took over the case, explained that David Crawford was part of a pattern they had been tracking for months. Someone was systematically targeting suburban homeowners, gathering detailed personal information, then breaking into their homes to photograph their private lives. The photographs seemed to be trophies rather than preparation for theft, as nothing of monetary value had been stolen from any of the victim locations. The investigation revealed that David Crawford was not his real name. Fingerprints from the lock-picking tools matched a man named Robert Hayes, who had been arrested in California for similar behavior but had failed to appear for his court date and disappeared. He had been targeting what he called happy people in suburban neighborhoods, people whose lives appeared successful and content from external observation. Detective Santos explained that Robert Hayes had a history of mental illness involving obsessions with other people's emotional states. He believed that happiness was a finite resource that could be stolen or absorbed through close observation and documentation. Break-ins and photography were part of an elaborate ritual designed to capture and collect the happiness he perceived in his victims. Robert Hayes was arrested 2 weeks later during an attempted break-in at another house across town. The homeowner had been warned about the pattern and was prepared with additional security measures. Hayes was charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and identity theft. I moved out of the Meadowbrook house before his trial concluded. Even with Hayes in custody, I could not shake the feeling that someone was still watching, still documenting, still smiling that terrible artificial smile while observing my private moments. The security cameras had provided protection, but they also revealed how vulnerable I had been without realizing it. The new apartment I found has multiple locks, a doorman and neighbors close enough that privacy comes with the comfort of nearby human presence. But sometimes late at night I find myself checking windows and locks repeatedly, listening for sounds that might indicate someone is trying to get inside to photograph whatever happiness they think they can steal from my life. My name is Charlotte, and I was 25 when I moved into the apartment on the 8th floor of the Canyon Vista complex in Phoenix, Arizona. After finishing my master's degree in environmental science, I had accepted a research position with a nonprofit organization focused on desert conservation. The apartment was small but affordable, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an impressive view of the surrounding mountains and enough space for me to live comfortably while saving money to pay off student loans. The complex was relatively new, built in the early 2000s with modern amenities and what the rental office proudly described as an advanced ventilation system designed to handle the extreme Arizona heat. Each unit was connected to a network of air ducts that circulated cool air throughout the building, with centralized controls that maintained comfortable temperatures even during the brutal summer months when outside temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees. I moved in during September when the weather was just beginning to cool from the oppressive heat of summer. The apartment felt like a sanctuary after months of job searching and the stress of graduate school, and I looked forward to establishing a routine that would allow me to focus on my new career and personal goals. The first indication that something was wrong came during my second week in the apartment. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a scratching sound coming from somewhere above my bedroom ceiling. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like claws scraping against metal, and it seemed to move from one corner of the room to another before fading into silence. I assumed it was mice or some other small animal that had gotten into the ventilation system, a common problem in desert climates where creatures seek shelter from extreme temperatures. I made a mental note to contact the building management in the morning, but was not particularly concerned about what seemed like a minor maintenance issue. The scratching sounds continued for several nights, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always following the same pattern of movement across my ceiling before disappearing. During the day, I tried to trace the sounds to their source, examining the ventilation grates in my apartment and listening for any unusual noises coming from the ductwork. The building maintenance supervisor, a friendly man named Carlos who had worked at Canyon Vista since its construction, came to investigate after I submitted a work order. He checked all the ventilation grates in my apartment, inspected the ductwork accessible from my unit, and found no signs of animal intrusion. Sometimes the metal expands and contracts when the temperature changes, he explained while securing a loose grate in my bedroom. That can create sounds that seem like scratching or movement, especially at night when everything is quiet. But the sounds I was hearing were not random creaks or settling noises. They were purposeful, consistent, and seemed to respond to my presence in the apartment. When I moved from the bedroom to the living room during nighttime episodes, the scratching would pause for several minutes before resuming in the area above wherever I had relocated. 3 weeks after moving in, I discovered the first piece of evidence that something was actually moving through the ventilation system. While cleaning my bathroom, I noticed that the ventilation grate above my shower had been damaged. Several of the metal slats were bent outward, creating an opening large enough for something to pass through, and there were scratch marks on the surrounding ceiling tiles that had not been there when I moved in. More disturbing was what I found on the bathroom floor, a piece of what appeared to be shed skin, translucent and flexible, roughly the size of my hand. It was unlike anything I had seen before, with a texture that was neither reptilian nor mammalian, but something entirely different. When I touched it, the material felt dry but somehow organic, like the molted exoskeleton of an insect, but much larger and thicker. I collected the skin sample in a plastic bag and took photographs of the damaged ventilation grate, then contacted both building management and the local animal control office. The animal control officer who responded to my call examined the evidence but was unable to identify the species that might have produced the shed skin. "It is not from any animal I am familiar with," he admitted while studying the sample under a magnifying glass. "The size suggests something fairly large, but the texture does not match any known reptile or mammal species native to this area. You might want to consider having an exterminator examine your apartment." The professional exterminator I hired found additional evidence of intrusion throughout the ventilation system. Several grates in the building had been damaged in ways consistent with something forcing entry from inside the ductwork, and there were scratch marks on metal surfaces throughout the network of air ducts that connected all the apartments in the complex. Most significantly, he discovered a pattern to the damage that suggested whatever was in the ventilation system was not randomly moving through the ducts, but was systematically exploring the building, testing access points, and learning the layout of individual apartments. "Whatever is doing this is intelligent," he explained while showing me photographs he had taken inside the ductwork with a specialized camera. "It is not just wandering around looking for food or shelter. It is mapping the building, learning where people live, studying their routines." The scratching sounds in my apartment became more frequent and more aggressive during my 4th week in the complex. Instead of brief episodes lasting a few minutes, the movements continued for hours at a time, accompanied by what sounded like something large, repositioning itself within the narrow confines of the ductwork. More disturbing were the changes in my apartment that began occurring during the day while I was at work. Items would be moved or rearranged in ways that suggested someone or something had been examining my personal belongings. Books would be pulled from shelves and left open to specific pages. Clothing would be removed from drawers and arranged in neat piles on my bed. Food items in my kitchen would be opened and partially consumed, but in patterns that did not suggest normal animal feeding behavior. The intruder seemed particularly interested in anything that might contain information about my schedule or personal habits. My work calendar would be moved from my desk to different locations in the apartment, always open to the current week. Personal letters and documents would be removed from filing systems and left in prominent locations as if they had been carefully read and studied. I began staying elsewhere, sleeping on a friend's couch while trying to determine my options for dealing with whatever was systematically invading my living space. But even when I was not in the apartment, the activity continued and intensified. Building security cameras captured unexplained movements in the hallways during nighttime hours, and other residents began reporting similar problems with damaged ventilation grates and missing personal items. The crisis reached its climax on a Friday evening in October when I returned to my apartment to collect additional clothing, and found that whatever had been living in the ventilation system had finally emerged into my living space. The evidence was unmistakable. Furniture had been moved to create clear pathways from the ventilation grates to various locations throughout the apartment, and there were wet tracks across my floors that suggested something large and possibly amphibious had been exploring my home. Most terrifying was the discovery that my bedroom had been transformed into what could only be described as a nest. My bedding had been arranged in a circular pattern around the room, mixed with additional pieces of shed skin and what appeared to be organic material brought in from outside the building. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of musk and decay that made it difficult to breathe. As I stood in my bedroom doorway trying to process what I was seeing, I heard movement from above my head. Looking up, I saw that the ventilation grate had been completely removed, creating a dark opening into the ductwork. Something was moving inside the duct, something large enough to block most of the opening, and I could hear what sounded like labored breathing or perhaps some form of vocalization I could not identify. I backed toward my apartment door, but before I could leave, something began emerging from the ventilation opening. What I saw defied any logical explanation or comparison to known animal species. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but moved with the fluid, boneless motion of something more akin to an octopus or large snake. The skin was translucent and moist, revealing internal structures that pulsed with movement, and it had multiple limbs that seemed to function both as arms and legs depending on the terrain it was navigating. Most disturbing were what appeared to be sensory organs positioned where a face might be on a human form. Clusters of dark spots that tracked my movement across the room with obvious intelligence and purpose. When it fully emerged from the ductwork and began moving toward me, I could see that it was much larger than the ventilation opening should have been able to accommodate, as if it could alter its physical dimensions to fit through spaces that were too small for its normal size. I ran from the apartment and called 911 from the hallway, but by the time police and emergency responders arrived, the creature had disappeared back into the ventilation system. The evidence of its presence remained: the damaged bedroom, the nesting materials, the shed skin samples, and the wet tracks throughout my apartment. The building was evacuated while specialists attempted to locate and remove whatever had been living in the ventilation system, but they found nothing. The ductwork was thoroughly cleaned and inspected, damaged grates were replaced, and the entire system was sealed with screens designed to prevent animal intrusion. But no trace of the creature itself was ever discovered. I moved out immediately and never returned to Canyon Vista. The building management offered to relocate me to a different unit, but I could not overcome the knowledge that something intelligent and potentially dangerous had been studying my life, learning my routines, and preparing for some form of direct contact that I was not willing to risk experiencing. The official explanation provided by wildlife experts who examined the shed skin samples was that an unknown species of large reptile or amphibian had somehow gotten into the building's ventilation system, possibly through construction gaps or damaged exterior screens. They theorized that the creature had been using the ductwork for shelter and had become confused or territorial when it encountered human activity. But their explanation did not account for the intelligence I had observed in the creature's behavior, the systematic way it had explored the building and studied the residents, or the deliberate modifications it had made to my living space. Whatever I encountered in that apartment was not simply an animal seeking shelter, but something with cognitive abilities and purposes that extended far beyond basic survival instincts. I still avoid apartments with central air conditioning and extensive ventilation systems. The idea that something unknown might be moving through hidden passages above my head, watching and learning and planning, creates a level of anxiety that makes sleep almost impossible. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, listening for scratching sounds that might indicate something has found me again, something that remembers my scent and habits from our brief encounter in Phoenix. My name is Jacob, and I was 28 when my wife Emma and I bought our first house in a gated community called Sunset Gardens in Clearwater, Florida. Emma had just given birth to our daughter Lily, and we were eager to establish ourselves in a safe, family-friendly neighborhood where we could raise our child without the concerns that come with urban living. The community was everything the real estate agent had promised. Well-maintained homes with manicured lawns, a private park with a playground, and neighbors who took pride in their properties and looked out for one another. Most of the residents were young families like ourselves or retirees who had moved to Florida for the weather and peaceful lifestyle. Our house was a 3-bedroom ranch with a small backyard and a 2-car garage, perfect for our growing family. Emma planned to stay home with Lily for the first year, while I worked night shifts as a security supervisor at Tampa International Airport. The schedule was challenging, but the pay was good enough to afford our mortgage and give Emma time to bond with our daughter during those crucial early months. Our next-door neighbor introduced himself the day we moved in. Richard Hoffman was probably in his early 40s, divorced, and worked from home as some kind of financial consultant. He was immediately helpful, offering to loan us tools, giving us recommendations for local services, and sharing information about homeowners association rules and neighborhood traditions. Richard had lived in Sunset Gardens for about 3 years, and he seemed to know everyone in the community. He was the type of neighbor you want in a crisis, knowledgeable, reliable, and always available to help with whatever problem might arise. Emma appreciated having someone nearby who could assist her during the day when I was sleeping after my overnight shifts. The first month in our new home was exactly what we had hoped for when we decided to move to the suburbs. Emma established a routine with Lily that allowed both of them to thrive, and I felt confident leaving for work each evening knowing they were safe in a neighborhood where people looked out for one another. Richard was particularly attentive, often checking in with Emma to make sure she had everything she needed. Emma mentioned how helpful Richard had become during our second month in the house. He would appear at just the right moments when she was struggling with groceries or when Lily was having a particularly difficult day. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate when Emma might need assistance, always showing up with offers to help that were exactly what she required. "He is almost like he has been watching us," Emma said one evening while I was getting ready for work. "Not in a creepy way, just really attentive to our schedule and what we might need help with." Yesterday, he knocked on the door right when Lily started crying. And he had this baby formula that he said he had, bought by mistake when he was shopping for his nephew. I was grateful to have such a considerate neighbor, especially given the demands of my work schedule. Night shifts meant I slept during the day when Emma was alone with Lily, and knowing that Richard was nearby provided peace of mind that allowed me to rest without constantly worrying about their safety. But Richard's helpfulness began to seem excessive during our third month in the neighborhood. Emma mentioned that he was stopping by almost daily, always with some reason that seemed plausible but felt increasingly unnecessary. He would bring mail that had been delivered to his address by mistake, offer to take out our trash if he noticed we had forgotten, or knock on the door to inform us about neighborhood association meetings or maintenance schedules. More concerning was Richard's detailed knowledge of our daily routine. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I returned in the morning. He was aware of Emma's schedule with Lily, including when she typically went for walks, when she did laundry, and when she usually prepared meals. His conversations were filled with references to activities he should not have been able to observe from his own property. He mentioned that Lily woke up crying around 3 in the morning last Tuesday, Emma told me during our 4th month in the house. But there is no way he could have heard her from his house, and I did not tell him about it. It makes me wonder if he is somehow listening to what happens inside our house. I decided to pay more attention to Richard's behavior and started documenting the timing of his visits and the information he seemed to possess about our family life. What I discovered was disturbing. Richard's interactions with Emma followed patterns that suggested he was monitoring our activities far more closely than any normal neighbor would. He would appear within minutes of my departure for work, as if he had been watching for my car to leave the driveway. His offers of help were always perfectly timed to Emma's needs, suggesting he was aware of her struggles before she had mentioned them to anyone. Most concerning, his casual comments about our activities included details that could only have been obtained through direct observation of our private moments. During my 5th month of night shifts, I decided to test my suspicions by varying my schedule without informing anyone in the neighborhood. Instead of leaving for work at my usual time, I would park my car around the corner and return to the house through the backyard, positioning myself where I could observe Richard's behavior without being seen. The results confirmed my worst fears. Within 20 minutes of my apparent departure, Richard would emerge from his house and position himself where he could observe our front door and windows. He would spend hours in his backyard or garage, always maintaining a clear line of sight to our house, occasionally using what appeared to be binoculars or a telescope to get a closer look at our windows. More disturbing was what I observed when Emma took Lily for walks around the neighborhood. Richard would follow at a distance, ducking behind trees or parked cars, maintaining visual contact while staying far enough away that Emma would not notice his presence. He was not simply being protective, he was conducting systematic surveillance of my wife and daughter. I confronted Richard directly after documenting several weeks of this behavior. I approached him in his driveway one evening before leaving for work and asked him about his unusual interest in my family's activities. His response was both defensive and revealing. "I am just being neighborly," he insisted, but his eyes would not meet mine. "Emma is alone during the day with a new baby, and I want to make sure she is safe. There have been break-ins in other neighborhoods, and I think it is important for neighbors to look out for each other." When I mentioned specific instances of his surveillance behavior, Richard became agitated and claimed I was being paranoid and ungrateful. He accused me of being an irresponsible husband and father for working night shifts and leaving my family unprotected. His anger seemed disproportionate to our conversation, and I realized that Richard's interest in my family was more personal and possessive than I had initially understood. The situation escalated dramatically the following week when I returned home early from work due to a power outage at the airport. Instead of entering through the front door, I came through the backyard and was shocked to discover Richard inside my house. He was sitting in my living room holding Lily and feeding her a bottle, while Emma was nowhere to be seen. Richard was wearing my clothes, my favorite sweater, my jeans, even my house slippers. He had positioned himself in my chair, surrounded by my belongings, and was caring for my daughter as if she were his own. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he did not show surprise or guilt, but rather annoyance that I had interrupted what he clearly considered a normal activity. "You are home early?" he said, continuing to feed Lily as if nothing unusual was happening. Emma was tired, so I told her to take a nap while I watched the baby. Lily and I were just getting to know each other better. I demanded to know where Emma was and how he had gotten into my house. Richard explained that Emma had given him a spare key weeks ago so he could help with emergencies, and that she had asked him to babysit while she rested. When I found Emma, she was unconscious in our bedroom, and I could not wake her despite my attempts. I called 911 immediately, and paramedics determined that Emma had been drugged with a powerful sedative that had been dissolved in her coffee. While she was treated at the hospital, police searched Richard's house and found evidence of extensive surveillance equipment, including cameras that had been positioned to monitor our home's interior, recording devices that had captured our private conversations, and detailed logs documenting our daily activities going back months. Most disturbing was Richard's collection of personal items he had stolen from our house. Emma's clothing, my work uniforms, photographs of our family, and even some of Lily's toys and blankets. He had created what could only be described as a shrine in his bedroom, with our belongings arranged around photographs of himself holding Lily and wearing my clothes. The police investigation revealed that Richard had been planning what he called family integration for several months. His goal was to gradually replace me in Emma's life by positioning himself as the more reliable and available father figure. eventually convincing her that she would be better off with him than with a husband who worked night shifts and was frequently absent from home. Richard's plan involved drugging Emma during my work hours and caring for Lily himself, creating a false sense of dependency and gratitude that he hoped would develop into romantic feelings. He had been documenting these sessions with hidden cameras, creating a record of himself functioning as Lily's primary caregiver that he planned to use as evidence of his superior parenting abilities. The investigation also uncovered similar patterns of behavior at Richard's previous residences in 2 other states. He had been arrested twice for stalking young mothers and had been forced to relocate each time after restraining orders were issued against him. His move to Florida had been motivated by the need to escape his history and find new targets who were unaware of his previous crimes. Richard was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including breaking and entering, drugging Emma, child endangerment, and stalking. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but the psychological damage to our family was far more lasting than his legal punishment. Emma struggled with anxiety and depression for months after the incident, unable to trust her own judgment about people's intentions and constantly worried that someone else might be watching our family. She required therapy to process the violation of having someone monitor our most private moments and manipulate her into accepting help that was actually part of a predatory plan. We moved out of Sunset Gardens within 6 months, relocating to a different state where we could start over without the constant reminders of Richard's intrusion into our lives. Emma still has difficulty accepting help from neighbors, and I changed today's shift work so I could be home with my family during evening hours when they feel most vulnerable. The experience taught us that the appearance of safety in gated communities can be deceptive, and that the neighbors who seem most helpful and attentive may have motivations that extend far beyond normal community concern. Richard's ability to present himself as the perfect neighbor while systematically planning to destroy our family demonstrates how predatory behavior can be disguised as kindness and consideration. Sometimes I wonder how many other families Richard had targeted before focusing on ours, and whether his pattern of behavior will continue after he is released from prison. The knowledge that someone can study your life so carefully and infiltrate your daily routine so completely creates a lasting sense of vulnerability that makes it difficult to trust anyone who shows unusual interest in your family's well-being. My name is Amelia, and I was 24 when I rented the studio space on the 3rd floor of the converted church in Beacon, New York. After finishing my MFA in painting, I needed an affordable place to work on my art while I applied for gallery representation and teaching positions. The building had been renovated into artist studios and apartments, but the rent was surprisingly cheap for the Hudson Valley area, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. The Church of Sacred Heart had been abandoned for nearly 15 years before developers bought it and converted the interior into live workspaces for artists. The Gothic architecture remained intact, with soaring ceilings, stained glass windows, and stone walls that had witnessed over a century of religious services. My studio occupied what had once been the choir loft, with tall windows that provided excellent natural light and enough space for large canvases. The building housed about 12 artists in various disciplines, from sculptors to musicians to writers, all drawn by the cheap rent and the romantic idea of creating art in a sacred space. Most of my neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, focused on their work and struggling to make ends meet like artists everywhere. The building manager, an elderly man named Frank who lived in the converted rectory, was helpful but seemed uncomfortable discussing the building's history. During my first month in the studio, I attributed the strange acoustics to the church's original design. Voices from other parts of the building would carry through the stone walls and wooden floors in unexpected ways, creating an almost constant background murmur of conversation and activity. The Gothic architecture amplified and distorted sounds, making it difficult to determine where voices were coming from or whether they were coming from current residents or from outside the building. But gradually I began to notice that some of the voices I was hearing did not match the artists I knew lived in the building. Late at night, when the studios should have been empty, I would hear what sounded like a large group of people singing in harmony, their voices echoing through the stone walls with the resonance of a full choir. The singing was beautiful but unsettling, particularly because it often occurred at 3 or 4 in the morning when I was working alone. The songs were hymns I recognized from my childhood, traditional Christian melodies that would have been appropriate for the building's original purpose. But the voices singing them had an otherworldly quality, as if they were coming from very far away or from people who were not entirely present in the physical space. When I mentioned the late-night singing to my neighbors, none of them reported hearing anything unusual. During my second month in the studio, the voices began to change in tone and content. Instead of ethereal hymn singing, I started hearing what sounded like heated arguments and heated discussions coming from somewhere below my studio space. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out individual words and phrases, though the conversations themselves made little sense out of context. The speakers seemed to be debating matters of theology and morality with passionate intensity, using language that sounded archaic and formal, like something from colonial New England rather than contemporary New York. They argued about sin and redemption, about the proper way to worship, about the corruption of modern society and the need to return to traditional values. Most disturbing was when the voices began to acknowledge my presence in the building. I would hear my name mentioned in their conversations, always in tones of disapproval and concern. They discussed my art, which they apparently could observe somehow, expressing horror at what they called blasphemous images and desecration of sacred space. My paintings were abstract expressionist works that explored themes of spirituality and transcendence, but from a contemporary rather than traditional Christian perspective. I incorporated imagery from various religious traditions and philosophical systems, creating visual dialogues between different approaches to understanding the divine. To me, the work was respectful and spiritually genuine, but the voices in the walls seemed to view it as an attack on their beliefs. The criticism became more specific and more aggressive during my third month in the studio. The voices would comment on individual paintings while I was working on them, offering detailed critiques that demonstrated intimate knowledge of my artistic process and intentions. They seemed particularly upset by a series I was developing that incorporated imagery from pre-Christian religious traditions alongside Christian symbolism. "The girl paints idols and calls it art," one voice would say, clearly audible despite my inability to determine its source. "She brings pagan corruption into the house of the Lord," another would respond. "Something must be done to stop this desecration before it spreads to the other inhabitants." The conversations would continue for hours, with multiple voices joining the discussion, all expressing variations on the same theme. My presence in the building was inappropriate. My art was offensive to their sensibilities, and action needed to be taken to remove me from what they considered their sacred space. I researched the building's history and discovered that the Church of Sacred Heart had been the center of a significant theological controversy during the 1970s. The congregation had split over questions of modernization and social justice, with conservative members accusing the progressive faction of abandoning traditional Christian values. The conflict had become so bitter that the church ultimately closed rather than continue operating with a divided congregation. Several former parishioners had died during the final years of the controversy, including the elderly organist who had led the choir for over 50 years and 2 deacons who had been particularly vocal in their opposition to the church's liberal direction. The building had remained empty for decades, with several attempts at renovation failing due to unexplained problems and accidents that drove away contractors and potential buyers. During my 4th month in the studio, the voices began to manifest in ways that went beyond simple auditory phenomena. I would arrive at my studio to find my paintings rearranged or turned to face the wall, as if someone was trying to prevent them from being displayed. Paint tubes would be opened and their contents spilled across my work surfaces, always in patterns that suggested deliberate vandalism rather than accidental damage. Most disturbing was when I discovered that someone had been altering my paintings during the night. Fine details would be changed in ways that modified the meaning of the images, often adding traditional Christian symbols or removing elements that incorporated non-Christian imagery. The changes were executed with skill and artistic understanding, suggesting that whoever was making them had significant knowledge of painting techniques. When I installed security cameras in my studio to document these incidents, the footage revealed nothing unusual during the times when the vandalism occurred. The cameras would record normally throughout the night, showing my empty studio with no signs of intrusion. But in the morning, I would find new damage that had somehow occurred without being captured on video. The crisis reached its climax during a winter storm in February when the power failed throughout the building. I had been working late by candlelight when the voices began speaking directly to me rather than discussing me in the third person. They called my name repeatedly, commanding me to stop painting and leave the building immediately. When I refused to respond, the voices became more aggressive and threatening. They began chanting in Latin, using phrases I recognized as exorcism prayers, treating me as if I were a demonic presence that needed to be driven from sacred ground. The chanting grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the stone walls with increasing intensity. As the chanting reached a crescendo, I felt a presence enter my studio. The temperature dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the candlelight. Something invisible began moving through my workspace, knocking over paint containers, tearing canvases, and destroying months of work with systematic thoroughness. I tried to flee, but found that I could not move my body according to my conscious will. Something was controlling my actions, forcing me to pick up matches and begin setting fire to my remaining paintings. I watched in horror as my hands, moving without my direction, systematically destroyed everything I had created during my time in the building. The fire spread quickly, threatening to engulf the entire studio and potentially the whole building. Only the arrival of the fire department, summoned by neighbors who saw smoke, prevented a complete disaster. When the firefighters found me, I was standing in the center of the burning studio, apparently unharmed but completely unresponsive to their attempts to communicate with me. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for smoke inhalation and what doctors described as a dissociative episode brought on by stress and isolation. When I was released, I discovered that my studio had been completely destroyed, along with all my artwork and supplies. The building management offered to relocate me to a different studio, but I declined and moved out immediately. The investigation into the fire concluded that it had been caused by unattended candles, a finding I did not dispute despite knowing that the candles had not been the true source of the flames. The insurance settlement covered my financial losses but could not compensate for the psychological trauma of having my body controlled by an external force. I moved back to the city and eventually returned to painting, but I avoid religious imagery entirely now and refuse to work in any building with a sacred history. The experience in the converted church convinced me that some places retain the spiritual energy of their original purpose in ways that can be hostile to activities they perceive as inappropriate or disrespectful. Other artists who lived in the building after my departure reported similar experiences with voices, vandalism, and inexplicable incidents. The building was sold again within 2 years and converted into luxury condominiums, with all traces of its religious architecture removed during the renovation. I sometimes wonder if eliminating the physical reminders of the building's sacred past also eliminated the spiritual presences that had made it uninhabitable for artists. The voices I heard in that building were not hallucinations or psychological symptoms, but the genuine spiritual presence of people who had been so devoted to their religious beliefs that death had not ended their commitment to protecting what they considered sacred space. Their opposition to my art was not personal malice, but sincere religious conviction that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. I still dream about that night when something else controlled my actions, forcing me to destroy my own work in service of beliefs I did not share. The memory of watching my hands move without my conscious direction serves as a constant reminder that human consciousness is more fragile than we like to believe, and that some places contain forces powerful enough to override our most basic sense of autonomy and self-control. My name is Ethan, and I was 29 when I moved into the 32nd floor apartment in the Millennium Tower on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. As a cybersecurity analyst for a financial services company, I could finally afford to live in the type of high-tech, high-security building that matched my professional expertise. The apartment featured smart home automation, multiple security systems, and panoramic views of Lake Michigan that made the premium rent seem worthwhile. I had specifically chosen this building because of its advanced security measures. Keycard access at every level, security cameras in all common areas, and a 24-hour concierge service that monitored everyone entering and leaving the building. After years of living in apartments with minimal security, the Millennium Tower felt like a fortress where I could finally relax and feel completely safe. My apartment was a one-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows, stainless steel appliances, and integrated technology that allowed me to control lighting, temperature, and security systems through my smartphone or voice commands. I installed additional security cameras inside my unit, connected to a professional monitoring system that would alert me instantly if anyone entered while I was away. The building attracted young professionals like myself, people who worked in technology, finance, and consulting, all drawn by the combination of luxury amenities and cutting-edge security features. Most residents kept to themselves, focused on demanding careers that required long hours and constant connectivity to work systems and clients. During my first month in the apartment, I began to notice small inconsistencies in my daily routine that suggested someone was accessing my living space. Items would be moved slightly from where I had left them, always in ways that were subtle enough that I might have attributed the changes to my own forgetfulness if I had not been trained to notice such details. My work in cybersecurity had made me naturally paranoid about unauthorized access, and I documented every anomaly I observed. Books moved from one shelf to another, kitchen items rearranged in drawers, clothing repositioned in my closet in ways that created more organized configurations than I typically maintained. The changes were always improvements rather than damage, as if someone was tidying my apartment according to standards that were more meticulous than my own. Whoever was entering my space was not stealing anything or creating disorder, but was instead organizing my belongings in ways that revealed intimate knowledge of my personal habits and preferences. More disturbing was evidence that someone was using my computer and accessing my personal files. I would find documents open that I had not accessed recently, browser histories that included websites I had not visited, and email messages that had been marked as read when I was certain I had not opened them. Professional paranoia kicked into overdrive, and I installed additional monitoring software on all my devices, including keyloggers and access logs that would record every interaction with my systems. The data I collected was deeply unsettling. Someone was using my computer regularly, always during hours when I was at work, accessing my files with the same level of technical skill that I possessed. The intruder knew my passwords, understood my file organization systems, and navigated my computer with the familiarity of someone who had been studying my digital habits for months. They read my emails, reviewed my financial records, examined my work documents, and browsed my personal files with systematic thoroughness. Most disturbing was evidence that they were using my access credentials to monitor my workplace systems from my home computer. My employer's security protocols required multi-factor authentication that should have prevented anyone else from accessing company networks using my login information. But somehow this person was bypassing those safeguards. I began varying my schedule and installing physical security measures throughout my apartment, including motion sensors, door alarms, and cameras positioned to monitor every possible entry point. The building's security system should have prevented unauthorized access, but I wanted redundant protection that would catch anyone who might have found ways to circumvent the primary defenses. The monitoring equipment revealed the shocking truth. No one was entering my apartment from outside. The security footage showed my apartment remaining locked and undisturbed during the times when I knew my belongings were being moved, and my computer was being accessed. Whoever was doing this was already inside my apartment and had been there the entire time. I reviewed months of security footage, looking for any evidence of an intruder, but found nothing that explained how someone could be living in my space without being detected. My apartment was not large enough to hide a person, and I had examined every closet, cabinet, and potential hiding place multiple times. The answer came during a power outage that shut down the building's electrical systems for several hours one evening in November. Without the constant hum of air conditioning, elevators, and electronic devices, my apartment was silent enough that I could hear sounds I had never noticed before. Breathing that was not my own, coming from somewhere inside my walls. Following the sound, I discovered that the advanced ventilation system that was one of the building's luxury features had been modified. The ducts were large enough for a person to move through them, and someone had created a hidden living space within the building's mechanical systems, complete with power taps and network connections that allowed them to monitor and control the smart home systems of multiple apartments. The person living in my walls was not a random intruder, but someone with extensive technical knowledge who had been systematically infiltrating the building's most technologically advanced units. They had been accessing the apartments of residents who worked in technology and finance, studying their digital habits and using their computers and network access for purposes I could not immediately determine. When I confronted the building management with evidence of this elaborate intrusion, they initially dismissed my concerns as paranoia. But when I provided detailed documentation of the unauthorized network access and the modifications to the ventilation system, they agreed to investigate. The building's security team, working with law enforcement, discovered that the intruder was Marcus Webb, a former contractor who had worked on the building's original construction and had maintained access through systems he had installed but never properly documented. He had been living within the building's infrastructure for over 2 years, moving between apartments through the ventilation system and using residents' technology and internet access to run an identity theft and financial fraud operation. Marcus had chosen victims based on their professional backgrounds, targeting people with high-level access to corporate systems that he could exploit for financial gain. He had been using my work credentials to access my employer's client databases, stealing financial information that he then sold to criminal organizations that specialized in identity theft and corporate espionage. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been accessing over 20 apartments in the building, always choosing units belonging to technology professionals whose digital expertise made them valuable targets for his operation. He had created detailed profiles of each resident, documenting their schedules, passwords, and personal habits with the same systematic approach I used in my own security work. Most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been recording everything that happened in the apartments he infiltrated, including private conversations, personal activities, and confidential business communications. He had accumulated thousands of hours of footage and audio recordings that he used both for blackmail purposes and to gather intelligence about his victims' professional and personal vulnerabilities. The legal consequences extended far beyond simple breaking and entering. Marcus was charged with multiple felonies, including identity theft, corporate espionage, computer fraud, and invasion of privacy. My employer launched an internal investigation to determine what confidential information had been compromised through my systems, and I faced professional consequences despite being a victim rather than a willing participant in the data breach. The building implemented extensive security upgrades, including complete replacement of the ventilation system and installation of additional monitoring equipment throughout mechanical areas. But the psychological damage to residents was more difficult to address. The knowledge that someone had been living within the building's walls, watching and recording our most private moments, created a lasting sense of violation that no security upgrade could eliminate. I moved out of Millennium Tower within 3 months of Marcus's arrest. Despite the improved security measures, I could not overcome the knowledge that my home had never actually been private, that every conversation, every activity, every moment of what I had believed to be solitude had been observed and recorded by someone whose technical skills matched my own. The irony was not lost on me that my expertise in cybersecurity had been completely useless against an intruder who understood technology as well as I did. Marcus had used my own tools against me, turning the smart home systems I had trusted into surveillance equipment that allowed him to monitor every aspect of my life. I now live in an older building with minimal technology integration, preferring the inconvenience of manual systems to the vulnerability that comes with automated security. I check my apartment for hidden cameras and recording devices regularly, and I never discuss work-related matters or personal information when I am at home. The experience taught me that privacy is largely an illusion in modern urban environments, where the same technology that promises security and convenience can be exploited by people with sufficient knowledge and access. Someone with the right skills can turn any smart home into a surveillance system, any connected device into a monitoring tool, any security measure into a vulnerability that can be exploited for criminal purposes. Sometimes I wonder how many other buildings contain people like Marcus, individuals who have found ways to live within the infrastructure and exploit the technology that surrounds us. The idea that someone could be watching from inside the walls of any modern apartment building makes it impossible to feel truly secure in any space that relies on electronic systems for protection. The silent watcher in my walls was not a supernatural threat, but something far more disturbing. A human predator who used technology and intimate knowledge of modern security systems to violate the privacy of people who believed they were protected by the same systems he was exploiting. That kind of invasion feels more permanent and more threatening than any ghost story because it reveals vulnerabilities in the infrastructure we depend on for basic safety and security. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture beyond the city lights into the forgotten corners of rural America with 8 chilling accounts that prove isolation breeds the darkest secrets. In this episode, we will journey through remote farmlands, abandoned backroads, and forgotten homesteads with 8 harrowing tales of countryside terror drawn from the authentic experiences of those who survived to share their stories. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from first-hand testimonies of individuals who witnessed horrors hidden in plain sight across America's heartland. To protect the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for spine-chilling true horror content that exposes the darkness lurking in unexpected places. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the buried truths that others fear to speak. Drop a comment below and let us know which type of rural horror story disturbs you most, and do not forget to share your own countryside encounters if you dare. Now let us begin our descent into the isolated terror that awaits beyond the last streetlight. So this is actually my late grandfather's story, but I found his journal after we cleared out the old farmhouse. The entry was dated October 15th, 1987, and it started with, "The Kowalski place has been empty for 3 years, but someone's been lighting fires in their kitchen every night this week." I never knew my grandfather kept a journal until we found it tucked inside his old tool chest, wrapped in plastic like it was some kind of treasure he needed to protect. My grandmother had passed 5 years earlier, and when we went through their belongings, most of it was just the usual stuff you'd expect from people who lived through the Depression. But this journal, this changed everything I thought I knew about the quiet man who taught me how to fix engines and never talked about his past. The Kowalski place sat about 2 miles down the gravel road from my grandparents' ranch, separated by nothing but rolling hills and barbed wire fencing that had seen better decades. According to what I learned from my grandmother years later, the Kowalskis had been decent neighbors for about 15 years. They kept to themselves mostly, raised a few head of cattle, and Mrs. Kowalski would bring over fresh bread every Christmas morning. Then one day in 1984, they just packed up and left. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just an empty house with the windows boarded up and weeds starting to claim the front porch. My grandfather wrote in his journal that he'd been noticing strange lights coming from the abandoned house for about a week before he decided to investigate. He described the lights as orange and flickering, definitely from the kitchen window, and they would appear every night around 9 o'clock and burn until sometime after midnight. He wrote that he'd mentioned it to my grandmother, but she insisted it was probably just teenagers using the place to party, or maybe someone passing through looking for shelter. But my grandfather had a different feeling about it, something that made his stomach turn every time he saw those lights dancing behind the dirty glass. On October 16th, the day after that first entry, my grandfather wrote that he'd walked over to the Kowalski place in broad daylight to get a better look. He brought his rifle, not because he was looking for trouble, but because out there in Wyoming you just never knew what kind of wildlife might have taken up residence in an abandoned building. When he got close to the house, he could smell something that reminded him of his time in Vietnam. Something he described as the smell of meat left too long in the sun but sweeter, like someone had tried to cover it up with perfume. The front door was still boarded up, but my grandfather noticed that the boards over the kitchen window had been removed and stacked neatly beside the house. The window itself was clean, cleaner than it had any right to be after 3 years of Wyoming weather. He wrote that he could see into the kitchen from where he stood, and everything looked exactly like the Kowalskis had left it. The table was still set for 2, with plates and silverware waiting for a meal that would never come. The old wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and my grandfather could see fresh ashes in the firebox, still warm to the touch when he reached through the window to check. That night, my grandfather positioned himself in his own kitchen with a pair of binoculars and waited. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared again, but this time he could see more than just the flickering glow. According to his journal entry from October 17th, he watched 2 figures moving around the Kowalski kitchen, and they were definitely not teenagers or drifters looking for shelter. He described them as a man and a woman, both dressed in what looked like the same clothes the Kowalskis used to wear. The man had on overalls and a flannel shirt, while the woman wore a simple dress with an apron tied around her waist. My grandfather wrote that he watched them for over an hour, and they seemed to be going through the motions of preparing and eating dinner. They would sit at the table, lift forks to their mouths, and even appear to be having conversation. But something about their movements seemed wrong to him. He described it as watching actors who had forgotten their lines, going through the motions of a play they barely remembered. The strangest part was that he never saw them actually eat anything, despite the fact that they spent the entire time making the gestures of people sharing a meal. The next few journal entries document my grandfather's growing obsession with the lights in the Kowalski house. He started timing their appearances, noting that they showed up at exactly the same time every night and lasted for exactly the same duration. He also started paying attention to other details that he'd initially missed. The figures never seemed to acknowledge the outside world, never looked toward the windows, or acted like they were aware that anyone might be watching them. They also never seemed to bring any food into the house or take any dishes away when they finished their nightly routine. On October 22nd, my grandfather decided to get a closer look. He wrote that he'd been losing sleep over the whole situation and needed to know what was really happening in that kitchen. He waited until the figures appeared at their usual time, then crept across the field between the two properties, staying low and moving slowly to avoid being seen. When he got close enough to peer directly through the kitchen window, what he saw made him question his own sanity. The man and woman were sitting at the table just like he'd observed through his binoculars, but up close he could see that their faces were wrong. My grandfather struggled to describe exactly what he meant by this, but he wrote that their features seemed blurred, like someone had smudged a photograph before it dried. Their eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion. And when they moved their mouths as if speaking, no sound came out. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather could see that the plates in front of them held nothing but what looked like small piles of dirt and dead insects. My grandfather wrote that he watched in horror as the woman picked up a fork, stabbed it into the pile of dirt on her plate, and brought it to her mouth. She chewed methodically, dirt falling from the corners of her lips, while the man did the same with what appeared to be a collection of dead beetles and moths. They ate in complete silence, never acknowledging each other or showing any sign that they were aware of my grandfather's presence just outside their window. The journal entry from October 23rd reveals that my grandfather had barely slept the night before, and he'd started to wonder if he was having some kind of breakdown. He wrote that he'd considered talking to someone about what he'd seen, but he knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, he decided to document everything as carefully as possible, hoping that writing it down would help him make sense of the situation, or at least provide evidence if anyone ever questioned his mental state. That night, my grandfather returned to his observation post in his own kitchen, but this time he brought a camera. He'd managed to borrow a telephoto lens from a friend in town, and he was determined to get photographic evidence of whatever was happening in the Kowalski house. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared as usual, and my grandfather started taking pictures. Through the camera lens, he could see the two figures more clearly than ever before. And what he saw convinced him that whatever was happening in that house had nothing to do with the living world. The figures moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like marionettes being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how puppets were supposed to work. Their heads would snap from side to side at odd angles, and sometimes they would freeze in the middle of an action for several seconds before continuing. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather noticed that they cast no shadows, despite the fact that the kitchen was lit by what appeared to be candlelight from several sources. On October 25th, my grandfather wrote that he'd developed the photographs he'd taken, and they showed nothing but an empty kitchen. The lights were visible in the pictures, but the figures he'd been watching night after night simply weren't there. This discovery sent him into what he described as a spiral of doubt and fear that lasted for several days. He questioned whether he was losing his mind, whether the isolation of ranch life had finally gotten to him, or whether he was experiencing some kind of delayed reaction to his experiences in Vietnam. But then, on October 30th, something happened that convinced my grandfather that whatever he'd been seeing was real, even if the camera couldn't capture it. He wrote that he'd been awakened at around 3 in the morning by the sound of knocking at his front door. When he looked outside, he saw the same 2 figures from the Kowalski house standing on his porch. They looked exactly as they had in the abandoned kitchen, complete with the blurred features and completely black eyes. But now they were at his door, apparently wanting to come inside. My grandfather wrote that he stood frozen in his hallway, afraid to make any sound that might alert the figures to his presence. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Between the knocks, my grandfather could hear what sounded like whispered conversation, but the words were in a language he didn't recognize, something that sounded like a combination of static and wind through dead trees. The journal entry from October 31st, the last one my grandfather ever wrote about the Kowalski house, describes how he spent the entire night huddled in his bedroom closet with his rifle across his knees. The knocking had stopped sometime around dawn, and when he finally worked up the courage to look outside, the figures were gone. But they'd left something behind that made my grandfather pack up his things and drive into town to stay with friends for the next 2 weeks. Someone had arranged small piles of dirt and dead insects on his front porch. Dozens of them, each one carefully placed in a perfect circle around his door. The dirt looked like it had been scraped from a grave, dark and rich and full of things that my grandfather didn't want to identify. The insects were all the same types he'd seen the figures eating in the Kowalski kitchen, beetles and moths and other creatures that looked like they'd been dead for months. The final entry in my grandfather's journal, dated November 15th, simply says, "The lights in the Kowalski house have stopped. I hope they've moved on to wherever they belong, but I have a feeling they'll be back someday, and next time they might not be content to just knock on the door." My grandfather never wrote another word about the Kowalski house, but he never went back to his ranch either. He sold the property 6 months later and moved into town, where he lived until his death 15 years ago. When I asked my grandmother about why they'd left the ranch so suddenly, she always said it was because my grandfather had gotten too old for the isolation and hard work. But after finding his journal, I realized she'd been protecting a secret that was too strange and terrifying for most people to accept. Last year, I drove out to where the old ranch used to be just to see what had become of the place. The house my grandparents lived in has been torn down, but the Kowalski place is still standing and it's still empty. The current landowner told me that he's tried to rent it out several times over the years, but tenants never stay more than a few weeks. They all complain about strange lights in the kitchen and the sound of knocking at their doors in the middle of the night. I didn't tell him what I'd read in my grandfather's journal, but I made sure to visit the property during daylight hours. Even in the bright Wyoming sunshine, the Kowalski house felt wrong somehow, like a place where something terrible had happened and never quite finished happening. I didn't stick around to see if the lights still appear at 9:15 every night, but I have a feeling that some things never really leave. They just wait patiently for the next person who's curious enough to look too closely. The strangest part of my grandfather's story isn't the supernatural elements or the unexplained phenomena. It's the fact that a man who survived combat in Vietnam and spent 40 years working a ranch in one of the most isolated parts of America could be driven from his home by something he couldn't fight or understand. Whatever those figures were, whatever they wanted, It was enough to convince a tough, practical man that some battles aren't worth fighting, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I am going to tell you exactly what I told Sheriff Morrison that night in November 2019, word for word, because I have gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Sheriff, you asked me why I will not let my kids go to any Halloween activities. Well, let me tell you about what happened when I was 12 years old at the Brennan family corn maze. This was back in October 1995, and the Brennan farm was about 15 miles outside of our little town of Clearwater. Population 837 if you counted the Hendricks twins who lived in that trailer behind the grain elevator. The Brennans had been running their corn maze for maybe 3 years at that point, and it had become the biggest Halloween attraction for 50 miles in any direction. Kids would come from as far away as North Platte just to get lost in their maze and scared by whatever surprises they had waiting in there. Now you have to understand something about rural Nebraska in the 90s. There was not much for kids to do, especially in October when the weather started turning cold and the days got shorter. We had already been through all the good fishing spots, we had ridden our bikes down every gravel road worth exploring, and most of us were too young to be interested in the kinds of trouble that the high school kids got into. So when the Brennan corn maze opened up each year, it was like Christmas morning for every kid in 3 counties. My best friend at the time was a kid named Danny Kowalczyk, and his older brother Marcus was supposed to take us to the maze that Saturday afternoon. But Marcus came down with some kind of stomach bug, or at least that is what he told his mother. I suspect he was just hungover from whatever he and his buddies had been drinking the night before. But Mrs. Kowalczyk believed him and told Danny that we would have to wait until the following weekend to go to the maze. Well, Danny was not having any of that. He had been talking about the corn maze for weeks, and he had already bragged to half our class that he was going to be the first kid to make it through without getting scared. So he came up with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan at the time. We would ride our bikes out to the Brennan farm on our own, pay the $5 admission fee, go through the maze, and be back home before dark. What could possibly go wrong? I should have known something was off when we got to the farm and saw how few cars were in the parking area. Usually the place would be packed on a Saturday afternoon, especially this close to Halloween. But there were maybe 6 or 7 vehicles there, mostly pickup trucks that belonged to local families. The Brennan farmhouse looked the same as always. White clapboard siding with green shutters and a wraparound porch decorated with pumpkins and corn stalks. But something about the whole scene felt different, quieter somehow. Mrs. Brennan was sitting at a card table near the entrance to the maze, just like she did every year. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s with graying hair and a friendly smile, the kind of person who would send you home with a plate of cookies if you helped her carry in groceries. But when we walked up to pay our admission, she looked at us with what I can only describe as concern. She asked us where our parents were, and when we told her that we had ridden our bikes out there by ourselves, she shook her head and said that maybe we should come back another day with adult supervision. Danny started to argue with her, saying that we were old enough to handle a corn maze and that we had been looking forward to this for weeks. I could see Mrs. Brennan wavering, probably remembering when she was 12 and desperate for some excitement. Finally, she sighed and took our $10, but she made us promise that we would stick together no matter what happened in the maze. She also gave us each a whistle and told us to blow them if we got separated, or if we needed help for any reason. At the time, I thought she was just being overly cautious, the way adults always seem to be when kids wanted to have any real fun. Looking back, I realized she was trying to protect us from something she knew was waiting in that maze. The entrance to the corn maze was marked by 2 tall posts with a wooden sign that read "Brennan Family Corn Maze. Enter at your own risk." The cornstalks on either side of the entrance were easily 8 feet tall, thick and healthy from what had been a good growing season. Once you stepped between those posts, the world outside the maze just disappeared. All you could see was corn in every direction, and all you could hear was the rustling of the stalks in the October wind. Danny immediately took charge, declaring that he had studied maps of corn mazes online and knew the secret to getting through them quickly. His strategy was to always turn right when we came to a dead end, which he claimed would eventually lead us to the center of the maze and then back out again. I had no better plan, so I followed him as we started making our way through the narrow pathways between the corn rows. The first 15 or 20 minutes were exactly what you would expect from a corn maze. We hit a few dead ends, backtracked, tried different routes, and gradually worked our way deeper into the maze. We could hear other people somewhere else in the maze, voices echoing off the cornstalks, but we never saw anyone. The pathways were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the corn was so thick that you could not see more than a few feet in any direction. That is when we started finding the scarecrows. The first one was just a traditional scarecrow, the kind you might see in any cornfield. It was made from old clothes stuffed with straw, with a burlap sack for a head and a floppy hat. But there was something about the way it was positioned that made both of us stop and stare. Instead of being mounted on a post, like a normal scarecrow, this one was sitting on a wooden chair that had been placed right in the middle of the pathway. Its head was tilted to one side like it was listening to something, and its straw-stuffed arms were positioned like it was reaching for whoever might walk by. Danny laughed and said that the Brennans were really going all out with their decorations this year. He walked right up to the scarecrow and poked it in the chest, making jokes about how realistic it looked. But I noticed that the clothes the scarecrow was wearing were not the usual old work clothes you would expect. This scarecrow was wearing a relatively new flannel shirt and blue jeans that looked like they had been worn recently. The boots on its feet were muddy, like someone had been walking around the farm in them just that morning. We took a few pictures with Danny's disposable camera and continued deeper into the maze. But the further we went, the more scarecrows we encountered, and each one was stranger than the last. The second one we found was standing at a crossroads where 4 pathways met, and it was pointing down one of the paths like it was giving directions. This one was wearing a woman's dress and had long brown hair that looked suspiciously real hanging down from under its floppy hat. The third scarecrow was the one that made me start feeling really uncomfortable. It was positioned around a corner in such a way that you would almost walk right into it before you saw it. This one was wearing a Letterman jacket from our high school, and the name stitched on the front read, Kawaltsiki. Danny went pale when he saw it because his older brother Marcus had a jacket just like that one. In fact, Danny was pretty sure this was Marcus's jacket, which should have been hanging in his bedroom closet back home. We spent about 10 minutes examining that scarecrow, trying to figure out how the Brennans could have gotten hold of Marcus's jacket. The only explanation we could come up with was that Marcus had somehow loaned it to them for their Halloween display, but that did not make any sense. Marcus was proud of that jacket and protective of it. He would never let anyone else wear it, much less use it to dress up a scarecrow. Danny tried to pull the jacket off the scarecrow to get a better look at it, but it seemed to be attached somehow. The more he tugged at it, the more agitated he became, and finally he started yelling at the scarecrow, demanding to know how it had gotten his brother's jacket. That is when I noticed that the scarecrow's head had shifted slightly, like it was turning to look at Danny while he yelled. I told Danny that we should leave the jacket alone and keep moving through the maze, but he was fixated on it. He was convinced that someone had stolen the jacket from his house and was using it to mess with us. He started talking about how we should find whoever was in charge of the maze and demand an explanation. But when he tried to use the whistle that Mrs. Brennan had given us, it would not make any sound. He blew as hard as he could, but nothing came out. That is when we heard the laughter. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the maze, a low chuckling sound that seemed to echo off the cornstalks from multiple directions at once. It did not sound like the kind of laughter you would hear from other visitors having fun in the maze. This was darker, more menacing, like someone was laughing at a joke that we were not in on. Danny and I looked at each other, and I could see that he was starting to get scared too. We decided to abandon his right turn strategy and just focus on finding our way out of the maze as quickly as possible. But no matter which direction we went, we seemed to keep running into more scarecrows. They were everywhere now, positioned at every turn and crossroads. Some were sitting, some were standing, and some were posed in ways that made them look like they were dancing or playing games with each other. The worst part was that they were all wearing clothes that looked familiar. One was wearing a dress that I was pretty sure belonged to my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson. Another was wearing a sheriff's uniform that looked exactly like the one Sheriff Morrison wore, complete with the badge and nameplate. There was even one wearing the same type of overalls that my grandfather always wore when he worked in his garden. As we got deeper into the maze, the scarecrows started looking more and more realistic. Their faces, which had been simple burlap sacks with painted features near the entrance, were now much more detailed. Some had faces that looked almost human, with realistic eyes and mouths that seemed to be smiling or frowning. One scarecrow that we passed had eyes that I swear followed us as we walked by. Danny was getting increasingly frantic, turning down pathways at random and sometimes doubling back when he realized we had been down the same route before. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and the shadows between the cornstalks were getting longer and darker. We had been in the maze for over an hour, and we were no closer to finding the exit than when we had started. That is when we found the scarecrow that was wearing Danny's clothes. It was sitting on a wooden stump in a small clearing, wearing the exact same red t-shirt and blue jeans that Danny had on. The same sneakers, the same baseball cap, even the same digital watch that his parents had given him for his birthday. But the most disturbing thing was the face. Instead of a burlap sack, this scarecrow had a face that looked exactly like Danny's, down to the freckles on his nose and the small scar on his chin from when he had fallen off his bike the previous summer. Danny started screaming when he saw it, not yelling or shouting, but actual screaming, the kind of sound you make when you are absolutely terrified and your mind cannot process what you are seeing. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me away from the scarecrow. But no matter which direction we went, we kept ending up back in the same clearing with the same scarecrow wearing his face. That is when I realized that we were not alone in the clearing. There were other people there, standing motionless between the cornstalks like they were part of the maze decorations. At first I thought they were just more scarecrows, but then I noticed that they were breathing. They were real people, but they were standing perfectly still with their arms at their sides and their eyes staring straight ahead. I recognized some of them. There was Tommy Richardson, who had graduated from our high school 3 years earlier and then disappeared one day without telling anyone where he was going. There was Mrs. Henderson, who used to run the post office before she had stopped showing up to work the previous spring. There was even Marcus Kowalczyk, Danny's older brother, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing when he said he was too sick to take us to the maze. They were all just standing there, not moving, not talking, not even blinking. But they were alive. I could see their chests rising and falling as they breathed, and occasionally one of them would twitch slightly, like they were trying to move but could not quite manage it. Danny was calling his brother's name, begging him to respond, but Marcus just stood there staring at nothing. That is when the man appeared. He stepped out from between the cornstalks like he had been waiting there for us to find him. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed to blend with the shadows between the corn rows. His face was pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. But the most disturbing thing about him was his smile. He had the kind of smile that you might see on someone who had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Except there was nothing funny about our situation. He told us that we were the guests of honor at his harvest festival, and that we should feel privileged to be chosen for such a special role. He explained that every year he selected a few special visitors to join his collection, people who would help him tend to his maze and make it more interesting for future guests. The scarecrows, he said, were just the beginning. The real magic happened when he found people who were willing to become permanent residents of his maze. Danny asked him what he had done to his brother, and the man laughed, that same chuckling sound we had heard earlier. He said that Marcus was perfectly safe and that he was simply learning to appreciate the simple pleasures of country life. All of his new residents, he explained, discovered that there was great peace to be found in standing still and letting the world move around them. They no longer had to worry about jobs or relationships or any of the complicated problems of modern life. I grabbed Danny's hand and we ran. We did not have any plan or strategy, we just ran as fast as we could through the corn maze, taking turns at random and hoping that we would somehow find our way out. Behind us, we could hear the man laughing and calling after us, telling us that we could not leave the maze until he gave us permission. He said that the maze would keep us there as long as he wanted, and that eventually we would get tired and have to stop running. But we did not stop. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to collapse. And somehow, miraculously, we found ourselves back at the entrance where Mrs. Brennan was still sitting at her card table. She looked up at us with a sad expression, like she had been expecting us to come running out of the maze in exactly this condition. She did not ask us what had happened or why we looked so terrified. She just told us to get on our bikes and ride straight home and to never come back to the maze again. She also made us promise that we would not tell anyone what we had seen in there because no one would believe us and it would only cause trouble for everyone involved. We rode our bikes home as fast as we could, and I have never ridden past the Brennan farm since then. Danny and I never talked about what happened that day, not even to each other. When people asked us how the corn maze was, we just said it was fine and changed the subject. When Danny's parents asked him where Marcus was, he told them that Marcus had said he was going to spend the night at a friend's house. Marcus never came home. His parents filed a missing person report and the sheriff organized search parties, but they never found any trace of him. The official explanation was that he had run away from home, maybe to join the military or find work in a bigger city. His parents eventually stopped talking about him, and after a few years, it was like he had never existed at all. The Brennan family stopped running their corn maze after that year. Mrs. Brennan told people that they were getting too old to maintain it properly, and that the insurance costs were getting too high. The cornfield where the maze used to be was planted with soybeans the following spring, and it has been soybeans ever since. But sometimes when I drive past the Brennan farm on my way to the grain elevator, I can see people standing in that soybean field. They are too far away for me to recognize their faces, but they are just standing there motionless, like they are waiting for something. And sometimes when the wind is blowing just right, I can hear that same chuckling laughter that we heard in the maze. That is why I will not let my kids go to Halloween activities, Sheriff Morrison. Because I know that there are things out there that use our celebrations and traditions as hunting grounds. They use our desire for fun and excitement to lure us into situations where we become vulnerable. And once they have you, they do not let you go. Danny Kowalczyk moved away from Clearwater the day after he graduated from high school. He left town without saying goodbye to anyone, including me, and I have not heard from him since. But I understand why he had to leave. Some experiences change you in ways that make it impossible to stay in the place where they happened. I stayed in Clearwater because this is my home, and because I feel like I have a responsibility to make sure that what happened to us does not happen to other kids. Every Halloween, I make sure to drive past every farm and rural attraction in the county just to see if there are any new corn mazes or haunted attractions that might be more than they appear to be. So far, everything has been normal. Just regular families trying to make a little extra money during the Halloween season, with regular decorations and regular scares. But I keep watching, because I know that someday something like the Brennan Maze might appear again. And when it does, I want to be ready to warn people before they make the same mistake that Danny and I made that October afternoon in 1995. That is my statement, Sheriff Morrison. I know it sounds crazy, and I know you probably think I am making it all up or that I misremembered what happened when I was a kid. But I am telling you the absolute truth, and I will swear to it on a stack of Bibles if you want me to. There are things in this world that use our own celebrations against us, and we ignore them at our own peril. Being a mail carrier in rural Kentucky means you see things that aren't meant to be seen. Most days it's just elderly folks excited for their Social Security checks. But Route 47 had one address that made my skin crawl every time I had to drive down that gravel road. The mailbox said Hendricks, but I'm pretty sure whatever lived in that house wasn't human. I started working for the Postal Service in 2019, fresh out of college with a degree I couldn't use and student loans I couldn't ignore. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and got me out of the apartment I was sharing with two roommates who thought hygiene was optional. Rural mail delivery seemed like it would be peaceful, maybe even therapeutic, driving through the beautiful Kentucky countryside, delivering letters and packages to people who were genuinely happy to see you. My route covered about 60 square miles of some of the most isolated farmland and forested hills in eastern Kentucky. The kind of place where your GPS gives up and you have to rely on handwritten directions from the postmaster. Most of my stops were at the end of long dirt driveways, serving families who had been living on the same land for generations. They were good people, the kind who would invite you in for sweet tea and ask about your family like they had known you all your life. But the Hendricks place was different from the very first day I had to deliver mail there. The mailbox sat at the end of a gravel road that curved up into the hills, disappearing behind a thick stand of pine trees that blocked any view of the house from the main road. The mailbox itself was newer than most of the others on my route, painted bright red with Hendricks, stenciled in black letters across the side. But there was something about it that felt wrong, like someone had tried too hard to make it look normal. The first time I drove up that gravel road to deliver a package that wouldn't fit in the mailbox, I got about halfway to the house before I started feeling sick to my stomach. It wasn't motion sickness from the winding road or anything like that. It was a deep, primitive kind of fear that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my hands shake on the steering wheel. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get away from that place as fast as possible. But I needed the job, and leaving mail undelivered was a good way to lose it. So I kept driving up that gravel road even though my heart was pounding and I was starting to sweat despite the cool October weather. The trees on either side of the road were dense and dark, creating a tunnel effect that made it feel like I was driving deeper underground instead of up into the hills. When I finally reached the clearing where the house sat, what I saw made me question whether I was losing my mind. The house itself looked normal enough, a single-story ranch-style building with vinyl siding and a metal roof. But there were things scattered around the yard that didn't belong in any normal residential setting. There were dozens of metal stakes driven into the ground in perfect geometric patterns, each one about 3 feet tall with something tied to the top that looked like strips of fabric or paper fluttering in the wind. The front yard was divided into sections by what looked like surveyor's tape stretched between wooden posts, creating a grid pattern that extended from the house to the edge of the tree line. Each section contained something different. One had what appeared to be animal bones arranged in circles. Another had pieces of broken mirror stuck into the ground at regular intervals, reflecting the sunlight in harsh, painful flashes. A third section was completely bare except for dark stains in the soil that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I sat in my mail truck for several minutes trying to decide whether I should deliver the package or just mark it as undeliverable and drive away. That's when I noticed that someone was watching me from the house. There was a figure standing at one of the windows, perfectly still, and even from 50 feet away I could tell that whoever it was wasn't moving at all, not even to breathe. They just stood there staring at my truck with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I decided to compromise. I would walk to the front door, leave the package, and get out of there as quickly as possible. But as I walked across that bizarre front yard, stepping carefully around the stakes and tape and mirror fragments, I started noticing details that made the whole situation even more disturbing. The strips of fabric tied to the stakes weren't fabric at all. They were pieces of clothing, children's clothing, faded and weathered like they had been hanging there for years. The bones in the circles weren't from the kinds of animals you would expect to find on a rural Kentucky farm. Some of them were too small to be from cattle or pigs, but too large to be from chickens or rabbits. And they were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like someone had been using them for some kind of ceremony or sacrifice. When I got to the front door, I could hear sounds coming from inside the house that didn't make any sense. There was a rhythmic tapping like someone hammering nails, but it was too fast and too regular to be any kind of normal construction work. Underneath that was a low humming sound, like machinery running. But it had an organic quality that made me think of insects or maybe even human voices. I left the package by the door and walked back to my truck as quickly as I could without running. The figure in the window never moved, never acknowledged my presence, just continued staring with that unblinking intensity. As I drove back down the gravel road, I checked my rearview mirror and saw that the figure had moved to a different window, one that gave them a better view of the road. They were still there, still staring, when I reached the main road and they disappeared behind the trees. That night I called my supervisor and asked if there was anything unusual about the Hendricks address that I should know about. He said he'd never heard anything strange about them, but the previous mail carrier on that route had requested a transfer after only 6 months. When I asked why, he said the guy claimed he was having nightmares about one of the houses on his route, but he never said which one or what the dreams were about. The next delivery to the Hendricks place came 2 weeks later. This time it was just regular mail, so I could leave it in the mailbox without having to drive up to the house. But when I opened the mailbox to put the letters inside, I found something that made me immediately slam it shut and step back. There were dozens of photographs stuffed into the mailbox, all of them showing the same thing. Me. Walking across their front yard, leaving the package, getting back into my truck. Someone had been watching me from multiple locations and taking pictures the entire time I was on their property. The photographs were taken from different angles and distances, suggesting that there had been more than one person watching me, or that someone had moved very quickly between different vantage points while I was delivering the package. Some of the photos were taken from ground level, as if someone had been hiding in the tall grass or behind the trees. Others were taken from above, like someone had been in the trees or on the roof of the house. I should have reported it to the police right then, but I was young and stupid and convinced myself that there had to be some innocent explanation. Maybe they were having problems with theft or vandalism and were documenting everyone who came onto their property. Maybe they were just paranoid about strangers and wanted to keep records for their own protection. I took the photographs with me and threw them away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. Every time I had to deliver mail to the Hendricks place after that, there were more photographs in the mailbox. Pictures of me driving up their road, pictures of me walking to their door, pictures of me back at the post office sorting mail, pictures of me at home in my apartment. Someone was following me, documenting my daily routine and using the mail delivery as a way to let me know that they were watching. The photographs got progressively more disturbing. Some showed me sleeping in my bedroom, taken from outside my window. Others showed me grocery shopping, getting gas, visiting friends. There were even pictures of me at places I didn't remember going or doing things I didn't remember doing, like I was being watched constantly and had become so accustomed to the surveillance that I wasn't even aware of it anymore. The worst ones were the pictures that seemed to have been taken from impossible angles or distances. Photos of me from directly overhead, as if someone had been floating in the air above me. Pictures that showed perfect detail of my face and expressions from hundreds of yards away, far beyond what any normal camera lens could accomplish. And there were pictures that showed me in places I had never been, doing things I had never done. But that looked absolutely real and convincing. I finally worked up the courage to drive back up to the Hendricks house and confront whoever was living there. This was a mistake that I still regret making, but at the time I was angry and scared and convinced that a direct confrontation was the only way to make the harassment stop. I drove up that gravel road on a Saturday afternoon when I wouldn't be in my official mail truck and wouldn't be violating any postal service policies. When I got to the clearing where the house sat, I could see immediately that things had changed since my last delivery. The stakes in the yard had been rearranged into different patterns, and there were new additions that made the whole scene even more disturbing. There were mannequins scattered around the property, dressed in mail carrier uniforms that looked exactly like the one I wore to work. Some of the mannequins were positioned like they were walking toward the house. Others were face down in the dirt like they had fallen or been knocked over. One mannequin was hanging from a tree branch by a rope around its neck, spinning slowly in the breeze. It was wearing a name tag that said Delilah in the same font and style as the official Postal Service name tags. When I got closer, I could see that it wasn't just wearing a mail carrier uniform. It was wearing clothes that I recognized as identical to ones in my own closet, down to the specific brand of shoes and the style of watch I wore to work. I walked up to the front door and knocked, ready to demand answers about the photographs and the surveillance and the creepy mannequins. But when the door opened, the person standing there wasn't what I had been expecting. It was a woman in her 50s, pleasant-looking, wearing a floral dress and an apron like she had been cooking dinner. She looked completely normal, like someone's grandmother, not at all like the kind of person who would engage in stalking and harassment. She smiled at me and said that she had been wondering when I would finally come to visit. She invited me in for coffee and said she had something special to show me that she thought I would find very interesting. Against every instinct I had, I followed her into the house, partly because she seemed so normal and harmless, and partly because I was curious about what kind of person could live in a place surrounded by such disturbing displays. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than the outside. Every wall was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same person. Me. Pictures of me from infancy to the present day, including photos that I knew for certain had never been taken. Baby pictures that my own mother didn't have. School photos from years when I had been homeschooled. Vacation pictures from trips I had never taken to places I had never been. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hendricks, explained that she had been documenting my entire life as part of a project she was working on. She said that I had been chosen for this project when I was very young, and that everything I had ever done, every place I had ever been, every person I had ever met, had been carefully planned and arranged to serve the purposes of her research. She showed me filing cabinets full of documents related to my life, report cards from schools I didn't remember attending, medical records from doctors I had never seen, employment records from jobs I had never had. There were detailed charts tracking my daily routines, my relationships, my preferences and habits. There were psychological profiles and behavioral analyses that went back decades, written in the kind of clinical language you would expect to find in a research facility or government laboratory. Mrs. Hendricks explained that I wasn't the first mail carrier to be selected for the project. There had been others before me, and there would be others after me when my part in the research was complete. She showed me photographs of previous mail carriers, all of them young women who looked similar to me, all of them documented in the same obsessive detail throughout their entire lives. When I asked what happened to the previous subjects when their participation in the project was finished, Mrs. Hendricks smiled, that same pleasant grandmother smile, and said that they had moved on to the next phase of the research. She led me to a back room that I immediately wished I had never seen. There were mannequins there too, but these ones weren't wearing uniforms. They were wearing the skin and hair of real people, preserved in some way that made them look almost alive, but not quite right. I ran. I didn't ask any more questions or try to get any more answers. I just ran out of that house and down that gravel road faster than I had ever run in my life. I got in my car and drove straight to the police station, where I tried to explain what I had seen and experienced. But when the officers went to investigate the Hendricks property, they found it completely empty. No house, no mannequins, no strange displays in the yard. Just an empty lot with no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The official explanation was that I had been under stress from my job and had experienced some kind of breakdown or hallucination. The Postal Service transferred me to a different route, and I never had to drive down that gravel road again. But I kept all of the photographs that had been left in the mailbox, and they're all still there, clear evidence that something really happened. I quit the Postal Service 6 months later and moved to a different state. I work in an office now, a nice, safe job where I never have to make deliveries to isolated houses or deal with people who might not be entirely human. But sometimes when I'm checking my mail at my apartment complex, I find photographs that I know I didn't take, showing me in places I don't remember being, doing things I don't remember doing. And sometimes late at night I can hear the sound of gravel crunching outside my window, like someone is walking up a long driveway that doesn't exist, coming to make a delivery that I don't want to receive. The rural countryside might look peaceful and innocent, but there are things living out there in the isolated places that use our routines and our jobs as ways to get close to us, to study us, to add us to their collections. I never found out what Mrs. Hendricks was really researching or why she had chosen me for her project. But I know that there are others out there, other people whose entire lives have been documented and manipulated by forces they don't understand for purposes they can't imagine. The next time you see your mail carrier walking up your driveway, remember that they might be carrying more than just letters and packages. They might be carrying the documentation of your entire existence, compiled by someone who has been watching you far longer than you could ever imagine. I moved to Louisiana in 2020 to study alligator migration patterns for my master's thesis. Local fishermen warned me about night research, said some waters aren't meant to be disturbed after dark. I thought they were just being superstitious until I set up my equipment near Dead Man's Cove and discovered what the gators were really feeding on. When I first arrived in St. Bernard Parish, about 40 miles southeast of New Orleans, I was excited to finally be conducting field research instead of just reading about it in academic journals. My advisor at Tulane had connected me with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and they had given me permission to tag and track alligators in some of the more remote waterways that most researchers avoided because of access issues. The local wildlife office was run by a man named Claude Boudreau, who had been working in the Louisiana wetlands for over 30 years. He was the kind of person who could tell you everything about the ecosystem just by looking at the watercolor and smelling the air. When I explained my research project to him, he was enthusiastic and helpful, offering me the use of a small airboat and giving me detailed maps of the waterways where I was most likely to find the kind of alligator populations I needed for my study. But when I mentioned that I would need to do most of my work at night, since that's when alligators are most active, Claude's demeanor changed completely. He started asking me a lot of questions about exactly where I planned to set up my equipment and whether I had considered doing the research during daylight hours instead. When I insisted that nighttime research was essential for accurate data collection, he reluctantly agreed to help me but made me promise that I would stay in radio contact with his office and that I would never work alone. The area where I was planning to conduct my research was a network of interconnected bayous and marshlands that had been largely untouched by commercial development. It was exactly the kind of pristine habitat that I needed for my study. But it was also incredibly isolated. The nearest road was over 5 miles away, and the only way to reach the research sites was by boat through narrow channels that wound through dense cypress swamps and salt marshes. For the first few weeks, everything went according to plan. I would arrive at my research sites in the late afternoon, set up my equipment before dark, and then spend the night collecting data on alligator behavior and movement patterns. The work was challenging and sometimes uncomfortable, but I was getting excellent data and making good progress toward completing my thesis. The problem started when I decided to expand my research area to include a section of waterway called Dead Man's Cove. According to my maps, this area had the highest concentration of large adult alligators in the entire parish, which made it perfect for my research. But when I mentioned to Claude that I wanted to work in Dead Man's Cove, he immediately tried to talk me out of it. He told me that area had a bad reputation among local fishermen and hunters, and that people who worked there at night sometimes reported seeing and hearing things that couldn't be explained. When I pressed him for more specific information, he said that several people had disappeared in that area over the years and that search teams had never been able to find any trace of them. He suggested that I stick to the research sites that I had already been using, where the alligator populations were almost as dense, but the area was considered safer. But I was a scientist, not a superstitious local fisherman, and I wasn't going to let folklore and ghost stories interfere with my research. Dead Man's Cove represented the best opportunity I had to collect data on large adult alligators, and I wasn't going to pass it up because of some vague warnings about bad things happening at night. So on a humid Tuesday evening in late August, I loaded my equipment into the airboat and headed out to Dead Man's Cove to set up my first night of research in the new location. The area was even more remote and isolated than my previous research sites, accessible only through a narrow channel that wound through miles of cypress swamp before opening up into a large, dark pool of water surrounded by dense marsh grass. The first thing I noticed about Dead Man's Cove was the smell. All of the bayou areas had their own distinctive odors, usually a combination of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and whatever marine life happened to be in the area. But Dead Man's Cove smelled different, like something large had died in the water and been left to rot. The smell was so strong that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The second thing I noticed was the unusual behavior of the wildlife in the area. In my previous research sites, I would usually see and hear a variety of birds, frogs, insects, and other creatures going about their normal nighttime activities. But Dead Man's Cove was eerily quiet. There were no bird calls, no frog croaking, no insect buzzing. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the sides of my boat and the distant splash of what I assumed were alligators moving through the water. I set up my equipment just as the sun was setting, positioning my cameras and sensors at strategic locations around the cove to capture as much alligator activity as possible. According to my preliminary surveys, there should have been at least a dozen large adult alligators in this area, but as the evening progressed, I wasn't seeing nearly as much activity as I had expected. It wasn't until around midnight that I started to realize why the local fishermen had warned me about this place. I was sitting in my boat, monitoring my equipment and taking notes, when I heard what sounded like human voices coming from somewhere across the cove. At first, I thought it might be other researchers or maybe fishermen who were working in the area. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the voices didn't sound quite right. They were speaking in what might have been English, but the words were distorted and unclear, like someone was trying to talk with their mouth full of water. And there were too many voices, at least a dozen different people all talking at once, but I couldn't see any boats or lights that would indicate the presence of other people in the area. I turned on my high-powered flashlight and swept it across the water in the direction of the voices. But all I could see were the glowing red eyes of alligators reflecting back at me. There were a lot of them, more than I had ever seen in one location, and they were all facing in my direction like they were watching me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The alligators weren't just floating in the water like they normally do. They were arranged in a perfect circle around something in the center of the cove, and they were all completely motionless. It looked like they were guarding whatever was in the middle of their formation. I used my telephoto camera lens to get a better look at what the alligators were surrounding, and what I saw made me question my own sanity. There were people in the water, at least a dozen of them, standing waist-deep in the dark water in the center of the alligator circle. They were all facing outward toward the alligators, and their mouths were moving like they were speaking, but I was too far away to hear what they were saying. The strangest part was that the people in the water didn't seem to be afraid of the alligators, and the alligators didn't seem to be threatening the people. They were just arranged in this bizarre formation, like they were participating in some kind of ceremony or ritual that I couldn't understand. I tried to get closer to see what was happening, but as soon as I started my boat engine, the entire scene just disappeared. The people in the water sank beneath the surface without making any splash or disturbance, and the alligators scattered in all directions. Within seconds, the cove looked completely normal again. Just dark water and marsh grass, with no sign that anything unusual had been happening. I spent the rest of that night trying to convince myself that I had been hallucinating or that my eyes had been playing tricks on me in the darkness. But when I reviewed the footage from my cameras the next morning, I could clearly see the people standing in the water, surrounded by the circle of alligators. The audio recordings had captured their voices, speaking in that strange, distorted language that didn't quite sound human. Over the next few weeks, I returned to Dead Man's Cove several more times to continue my research, and each time I witnessed similar scenes. Groups of people would appear in the water around midnight, always surrounded by alligators, always speaking in that disturbing waterlogged language. Sometimes there would be more people, sometimes fewer, but they were always there, and they always disappeared as soon as I tried to get closer. I started to recognize some of the faces in the water. One of them looked like a fisherman named Eddie Thibodeau, who had disappeared from the area 3 years earlier. Another looked like a woman named Marie Boudreau, Claude's cousin, who had gone missing while collecting samples for the university environmental lab. A third looked like a teenage boy who had been reported missing from a nearby town the previous summer. The most disturbing realization was that the people in the water all looked exactly the same as they had when they disappeared. They hadn't aged or decomposed or changed in any way. They just stood there in the dark water, speaking their incomprehensible language. while the alligators formed protective circles around them. I tried to research the history of Dead Man's Cove to see if I could find any explanation for what I was witnessing. What I discovered was that people had been disappearing in that area for over a century. Native American tribes had considered the area to be cursed or haunted, and early French settlers had reported similar disappearances. Local records showed that dozens of people had vanished in Dead Man's Cove over the years, and none of them had ever been found. The more I learned about the history of the area, the more I realized that I was witnessing something that had been happening for generations. The people who disappeared in Dead Man's Cove didn't die in the conventional sense. They became part of something else. Something that existed in the dark water and communicated in a language that human ears weren't meant to understand. I completed my thesis research using data from other locations, and I never returned to Dead Man's Cove. But I still have the video footage and audio recordings from my nights there, and sometimes I review them trying to understand what I witnessed. The voices in the recordings have a hypnotic quality that makes me want to go back to the water, to join the circle of people standing in the darkness, to learn their language and become part of whatever ancient ceremony they're conducting. The local fishermen were right to warn me about disturbing those waters at night. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some research is too dangerous to conduct. The alligators in Dead Man's Cove aren't just predators feeding on fish and small mammals. They're guardians of something much older and more mysterious, something that collects people who venture too close to the truth and transforms them into permanent residents of the dark water. My advice to anyone conducting research in remote areas is to listen to the warnings of local people, even if their concerns seem superstitious or unscientific. Sometimes folklore and legend are the only ways that communities can pass down knowledge about dangers that science isn't equipped to understand or explain. And sometimes the most important discovery you can make is knowing when to stop looking and walk away. My grandmother used to say that every small town has one secret that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. I thought she was just being dramatic until the summer of 2018 when I moved back to help with her medical bills. That's when I learned what really happened at the monthly potluck dinners at Cornerstone Baptist Church, and why certain families never attended. I had been living in Austin for about 8 years, working as a mechanic at one of those quick change oil places. When my grandmother called me in June of 2018 and told me that her diabetes was getting worse and she needed help managing her medications, I knew I had to come back. She had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. So I packed up my belongings and drove back to Cedar Ridge, Texas, population 412. My grandmother lived in the same house where I had spent my teenage years, with a backyard that backed up to the cemetery behind the Baptist church. Within the first week, I realized that my grandmother's health problems were more serious than she had let on. But as she got better with my help, she started talking about the church potlucks. Cornerstone Baptist Church held a community potluck dinner on the first Sunday of every month. My grandmother had been attending these for over 30 years, but something had changed in recent years. She would say that the food tasted strange, or that people were acting differently, or that there were families attending who she didn't recognize. I offered to go with her to the next potluck to see what she was worried about. The potluck was scheduled for the first Sunday in July, and my grandmother spent the entire week preparing her famous cornbread dressing. The fellowship hall was crowded when we arrived, easily 60 people in a town of 400. My grandmother introduced me to several people that I remembered from my childhood, but there were also a lot of faces that I didn't recognize. When we sat down to eat, I immediately understood what my grandmother had been trying to tell me. My first bite of what was supposed to be macaroni and cheese had a flavor that I couldn't identify. Something earthy and bitter. The green bean casserole had the same off taste, and the potato salad made my mouth feel numb. I looked around to see if other people were having the same reaction, but everyone else seemed to be eating normally and enjoying their meals. Even my grandmother was eating steadily, though I could see concentration on her face. That's when I noticed the families that weren't there. Growing up in Cedar Ridge, I had known most of the regular church families, but several of these families were missing. The Hendersons, the Rodriguezes, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis. When I asked my grandmother about this, she told me that these families had stopped coming to the potlucks about 2 years earlier. They still attended regular church services, but they always made excuses to leave before the monthly potluck dinners. I decided to introduce myself to some of the families that I didn't recognize. The first family I approached looked at each other with expressions that seemed almost panicked when I told them my name. They claimed to have been attending the church for years, but when I asked them where they lived or what brought them to Cedar Ridge, they gave vague answers that didn't make sense. The same thing happened with the next few families. They all claimed to be regular members, but none could give specific details about their lives in Cedar Ridge. When I asked one woman where her children went to school, she said they were homeschooled. When I asked a man what he did for work, he said he was retired. I started to feel like I was in some surreal dream where everyone was playing a role, but nobody could remember their lines. These people looked normal and acted friendly, but there was something hollow about their responses. On the drive home, my grandmother told me that she had been wondering about the same thing for months. More and more unfamiliar families had been showing up at the potlucks, but when she tried to get to know them better, they would always change the subject. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. She had started keeping track of the families who attended the potlucks, and she had noticed a pattern. Every few months, one of the regular Cedar Ridge families would stop coming to the potlucks, and shortly afterward, a new, unfamiliar family would start attending. Over the next few weeks, I started investigating. I went to the library and looked through old church directories and newspaper archives. What I found was disturbing. According to the records I could find, several of the families that claimed to be longtime members had never existed in Cedar Ridge. There were no birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, or any other official documents proving they had ever lived in the area. I also discovered something else frightening. When I looked through old newspaper obituaries, I found records for several Cedar Ridge families who had supposedly died in accidents over the past few years. But these were the same families that my grandmother said had simply stopped attending the potlucks. The Martinez family had reportedly died in a house fire 2 years earlier. But according to my grandmother, they hadn't died. They had just stopped coming to the potlucks. The Johnson family had supposedly died in a car accident, but my grandmother remembered them being alive and well. The more I researched, the more I realized there was a systematic cover-up happening. Families were disappearing, official records were being falsified to make it look like they had died, and new families were taking their places at the church potlucks. I confronted my grandmother with what I had discovered, and she broke down and told me the rest. She said that the food at the potlucks definitely contained something that affected people's memories and decision-making abilities. She had been forcing herself to eat as little as possible to try to dilute whatever drugs were being used. The most terrifying part was what she had discovered about Pastor Williams, the minister, who had been leading Cornerstone Baptist Church for the past 3 years. He had arrived shortly before the disappearances started. She had researched him and discovered that he had been the minister at churches in several other small towns, and in each case, there had been unexplained disappearances during his tenure. My grandmother believed that Pastor Williams was part of some organized group that targeted small, isolated communities where people could disappear without attracting outside attention. They would replace the missing families with their own people, gradually taking over the community from within. I wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother begged me not to. She pointed out that the local sheriff was a regular attendee at the church potlucks and was likely either part of the conspiracy or under the influence of whatever drugs were being used. Instead, we decided to leave Cedar Ridge as quietly as possible. I told my grandmother to pack only her most essential belongings, and we drove to Austin that same night without telling anyone we were leaving. My grandmother lived with me in Austin for the next 2 years until she passed away from complications related to her diabetes. She would have nightmares about church potlucks and wake up convinced that someone was trying to poison her food. After she died, I tried to find out what had happened to Cedar Ridge, but according to online records, the town no longer exists. The post office was closed, the school district was dissolved, and all the residents supposedly moved away to other communities. But I know that's not what really happened. I think Pastor Williams and his people finally completed their takeover of the town, and they erased it from official records to cover up their crimes. The real residents of Cedar Ridge are probably dead, and the people who replaced them have moved on to their next target. I still have nightmares about that last potluck dinner, and I can still taste that bitter, earthy flavor that was in all the food. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother and I would have been the next ones to disappear if we had stayed any longer. The scariest part is realizing how easy it would be for this kind of thing to happen without anyone noticing. Small rural communities are isolated and self-contained, and people are used to families moving away for economic reasons. If the disappearances are gradual and the cover-up is thorough, who would ever investigate? My advice to anyone living in a small town is to pay attention to the people around you. If families start disappearing and being replaced by strangers who can't give you straight answers about their backgrounds, don't assume it's just a coincidence. And whatever you do, don't eat anything at church potluck dinners unless you're absolutely certain you know who prepared it. I was covering a 4th grade class in October 2021 when I found a student essay that made my blood run cold. The assignment was write about your family's traditions, and little Emma Richardson had written about helping her dad with the special harvest every fall. What she described wasn't corn or apples. I had been working as a substitute teacher in Millbrook, Oregon for about 6 months when this happened. Millbrook was one of those small farming communities where everybody knew everybody, and outsiders were treated with polite suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. The kind of place where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival in late October, where local farmers would display their best produce and families would compete in pie baking contests. The regular 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called in sick with what she said was a stomach bug, so I was covering her class for what I expected would be a routine day of math worksheets and reading comprehension exercises. But Mrs. Patterson had left instructions for the students to work on their family traditions essay, which was supposed to be part of a larger unit on community and heritage. Most of the essays were exactly what you would expect from 9- and 10-year-olds writing about their families. Tommy wrote about how his grandmother taught him to make apple butter every fall. Sarah described her family's tradition of camping at the coast every summer. Michael wrote about helping his father repair tractors and other farm equipment during the winter months when there was less field work to do. But Emma Richardson's essay was different. It was longer and more detailed than the others, written in the careful handwriting of a child who was trying very hard to get every word exactly right. And what she described made my hands shake as I read it. Emma wrote about how every October, when the regular harvest was finished and most of the other farming families were preparing for winter, her father would take her and her older brother out to what she called the back fields to help with a different kind of harvest. She described how they would work at night, using flashlights and lanterns because this special harvest could only be done in darkness. According to Emma, the back fields didn't grow the same crops as the rest of their farm. Instead of corn or wheat or vegetables, these fields grew what she called the tall ones and the quiet ones. She wrote that the tall ones looked like people but were much taller than any person she had ever seen, and they stood perfectly still in neat rows like regular crops. The quiet ones were smaller, about the size of children, and they were always sleeping with their eyes closed. Emma's essay explained that the special harvest involved carefully digging up the tall ones and the quiet ones and loading them onto trucks to be taken to what she called the delivery place. She wrote that her job was to help clean the dirt off of them and to make sure that none of them were damaged during the harvesting process. Her older brother's job was to help their father carry the heavier ones to the trucks. The most disturbing part of Emma's essay was her description of what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested. She wrote that some of them would be kept in the barn over the winter, where they would slowly wake up and start moving around. Others would be taken immediately to customers who lived in other towns and had placed special orders for specific types. Emma seemed to think that this was a completely normal family business, like raising cattle or growing vegetables for market. She wrote about how proud she was to be old enough to help with the special harvest, and how her father had told her that someday she would inherit the back fields and continue the family tradition. But the details in her essay made it clear that whatever the Richardsons were harvesting in their back fields, it wasn't anything that should be growing in the soil of rural Oregon. Emma described how the tall ones and quiet ones had to be handled very carefully because they would sometimes move or make sounds when they were being dug up, even though they were supposed to be sleeping. She wrote about how her father always carried a special tool that he would use to make sure they stayed quiet during the harvesting process. Most disturbing of all, Emma wrote about how the quiet ones looked just like the children from her school, and how she sometimes recognized faces of kids who had moved away from Millbrook in previous years. She seemed to think this was just a coincidence, and she wrote about how excited she would get when she found one that looked like someone she knew. After I finished reading Emma's essay, I sat at Mrs. Patterson's desk for several minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to believe that Emma had just written a creative fiction story instead of following the assignment instructions. Maybe she had been reading too many scary books or watching too many horror movies, and her imagination had gotten carried away. But there was something about the matter-of-fact way that Emma had written about these disturbing events that convinced me she was describing something she had actually experienced. The details were too specific and too consistent for a child to have made up, and there was no sense in her writing that she understood there was anything unusual or frightening about what she was describing. I decided to talk to Emma privately during recess to see if I could get a better understanding of what she had written about. When I asked her to explain more about her family's special harvest, she became very excited and started telling me additional details that hadn't been in her essay. Emma told me that the back fields had been in her family for generations, and that her great-grandfather had been the first Richardson to discover that these particular crops would grow there. She said that most people didn't know about the special harvest because it was a family secret, and that her father had made her promise never to talk about it with anyone outside the family. When I asked Emma what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested, she explained that they were sold to people who needed them for important work in other places. She said that her father never told her exactly what kind of work they were used for, but that it must be very important because the customers were willing to pay a lot of money for them. The most chilling moment of our conversation came when I asked Emma if she had ever seen any of the tall ones or quiet ones moving or acting like they were alive. She looked at me with the serious expression that children get when they're trying to explain something important to an adult who doesn't understand. Emma told me that of course they were alive, but that they were sleeping very deeply and wouldn't wake up completely until they reached their final destinations. She said that sometimes they would move a little bit or make soft sounds, but that this was normal and nothing to be worried about. She explained that her father had taught her how to tell the difference between the ones that were sleeping normally and the ones that might be having problems. After my conversation with Emma, I knew that I had to report what I had learned to someone in authority. But I also knew that if I was wrong about what Emma was describing, I could be ruining the reputation of a local farming family based on the imagination of a 9-year-old girl. I decided to call the Oregon State Police and speak to someone in their criminal investigation division. I explained that I was a substitute teacher and that I had concerns about possible child endangerment based on an essay written by one of my students. The detective I spoke to was initially skeptical, but when I read Emma's essay to him over the phone, he agreed that it warranted further investigation. 2 days later, I learned that the state police had obtained a search warrant for the Richardson farm and had conducted a thorough investigation of the property. What they found in the back fields confirmed my worst fears about what Emma had been describing in her essay. The Richardson family had been operating what law enforcement officials described as a human trafficking operation disguised as a farming business. The backfields contained dozens of makeshift graves where victims had been buried in shallow pits and kept in drug-induced comas until they could be transported to buyers in other states. Emma's father and older brother were arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder. Emma and her mother were taken into protective custody, and Emma was placed in foster care with a family in a different part of the state. The investigation revealed that the Richardson operation had been active for at least 10 years, and that they had been responsible for the disappearances of dozens of people from small towns throughout Oregon and Northern California. The victims included both adults and children, and many of them matched the descriptions of people who had been reported missing from Millbrook and surrounding communities. Emma's essay had described something so horrific that my mind had initially refused to accept that it could be real. But her innocent matter-of-fact account of helping her family with their special harvest had provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed to shut down a criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The most heartbreaking part of this entire experience was realizing that Emma had been raised to believe that participating in these crimes was a normal family tradition. She had no understanding that what her father was doing was wrong, and she had been proud of her role in helping with the harvest. I never saw Emma again after she was placed in foster care, but I often think about her and hope that she has been able to get the help she needs to recover from the trauma of her childhood. I also think about how many other children might be living in situations where they are being taught to participate in criminal activities disguised as family traditions. The Richardson case taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the most innocent voices can reveal the darkest truths. As teachers, we have a responsibility to pay attention to what children tell us, even when their stories seem too disturbing to believe. The Hartwell-Lindbergh property dispute started in 1952 over 18 inches of farmland. By 2019, when both families hired me to settle it once and for all, that 18-inch strip had become a burial ground. What I found when I started measuring that contested boundary line will haunt me until the day I die. I had been working as a licensed land surveyor in rural Minnesota for about 15 years when the Hartwell and Lindbergh families contacted me about resolving their boundary dispute. These kinds of cases were pretty common in farming communities where property lines that had been established decades earlier sometimes became unclear due to missing markers, conflicting deeds, or changes in the landscape over time. What made this particular case unusual was the length of time that the dispute had been going on. According to the documents that both families provided me, the disagreement over the exact location of their shared property line had been ongoing for nearly 70 years. 3 generations of Hartwells and Lindberghs had been arguing over the same strip of land, and the animosity between the families had only gotten worse with each passing decade. The disputed area was a narrow strip of farmland approximately 18 inches wide and about 200 yards long, running along the border between the Hartwell farm to the north and the Lindbergh farm to the south. Both families claimed ownership of this strip, and both had documentation that seemed to support their claims. The Hartwells had a deed from 1951 that described their property as extending to the old stone fence line, which they claimed included the disputed strip. The Lindberghs had a survey from 1953 that showed their property extending to the natural drainage ditch, which they argued was located 18 inches north of where the Hartwells claimed it was. Over the years, both families had tried to resolve the dispute through various means. They had hired lawyers, consulted with other surveyors, and even attempted mediation through the County Agricultural Extension Office. But every attempt at resolution had failed, usually because one family or the other would refuse to accept the proposed solution. By 2019, the situation had reached a crisis point. The current generation of both families was getting older, and they wanted to settle the dispute before they passed the farms on to their children. Both sides were tired of the ongoing conflict, but neither was willing to give up what they believed was rightfully theirs. That's when they decided to hire me to conduct a comprehensive boundary survey using modern GPS technology and historical research to determine the exact location of the property line once and for all. Both families agreed that they would accept my findings as final and legally binding, regardless of which side the decision favored. I started my work by reviewing all of the historical documents related to both properties, including deeds, surveys, tax records, and aerial photographs dating back to the 1940s. I also researched the history of the area to understand how the land had been originally surveyed and divided when it was first settled. What I discovered during my research was that the property dispute was more complex than either family had realized. The original survey of the area had been conducted in 1894, but the surveyor's notes were incomplete and contained several inconsistencies. Additionally, both the old stone fence line and the natural drainage ditch mentioned in the competing deeds had been altered multiple times over the decades, making it difficult to determine their exact historical locations. The next phase of my work involved conducting a physical survey of the disputed area using GPS equipment and traditional surveying tools. This was where things started to get strange. When I began measuring the contested strip of land, I immediately noticed that the soil in that area was different from the surrounding farmland. Instead of the rich black topsoil that covered the rest of both farms, the disputed strip had lighter-colored sandy soil that seemed to have been disturbed relatively recently. I also noticed that nothing grew well in that strip. While the fields on both sides supported healthy crops of corn and soybeans, the vegetation in the disputed area was sparse and sickly-looking. The few weeds and grasses that did manage to grow there were stunted and discolored, as if the soil was contaminated with something that inhibited plant growth. At first, I assumed that the poor soil quality was the result of decades of farming practices, or maybe the application of too much fertilizer or herbicide. But as I continued my survey work, I started to suspect that there might be something buried in that strip of land. My suspicions were confirmed when I used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. The radar readings showed multiple large objects buried at depths ranging from 3 to 6 feet below the surface. The objects were roughly human-sized and were arranged in 2 neat rows running the entire length of the disputed strip. I immediately contacted both families to inform them of what I had found, and I recommended that we stop the survey work and contact law enforcement. But both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs insisted that I continue with the survey and not involve any outside authorities until we had determined the exact nature of what was buried there. Against my better judgment, I agreed to excavate one of the buried objects to see what we were dealing with. What we found made me wish I had called the police immediately. The first object we uncovered was a wooden coffin that appeared to have been buried sometime in the 1950s or early 1960s. Inside the coffin was the body of a man in his 30s or 40s wearing clothes that were consistent with the time period when the coffin was buried. The body was remarkably well preserved, probably due to the sandy soil conditions and the sealed environment inside the coffin. But what made this discovery truly disturbing was that the man had obviously died violently. His skull had been crushed, and there were multiple stab wounds visible in his clothing and the remains of his flesh. This was clearly a murder victim, not someone who had died of natural causes and been buried in a family cemetery. When I showed the body to representatives from both families, their reactions confirmed my worst fears about what we had discovered. Instead of being shocked or horrified by finding a murder victim buried on their property, both families seemed to recognize the deceased man and understand why he was there. Old Henrik Lindbergh, who was in his 80s and the patriarch of the Lindbergh family, looked at the body and said, "That's Bill Morrison. He was asking too many questions about what happened to his brother." Henrik's son nodded in agreement and added, "Dad always said that Bill should have minded his own business." From the Hartwell side, the reaction was similar. Martha Hartwell, who was Henrik's contemporary and the family matriarch, examined the body and said, "I remember when we buried him. It was right after the harvest in 1953. Her grandson asked if they should continue digging up the others, and Martha nodded and said, "Might as well finish what we started." Over the next few hours, we excavated 6 more bodies from the disputed strip. All of them showed signs of violent death, and all of them were recognized by members of both families as people who had supposedly left the area decades earlier, or who had simply disappeared without explanation. The families explained to me that the disputed property strip had been used as a burial ground for anyone who threatened to expose what they called the family business. Both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs had been involved in organized crime activities since the 1940s, including bootlegging during Prohibition, cattle rustling, and later drug trafficking. The reason that both families had claimed ownership of the burial strip was not because they wanted the land for farming, but because they each wanted to control access to the evidence of their crimes. The ongoing property dispute had been a way to ensure that no one else would ever develop or disturb that area. The most disturbing part of this revelation was learning that the violence had continued into recent years. The most recently buried body was that of a man named David Chen, who had disappeared in 2011 after asking too many questions about suspicious activities on the neighboring farms. Both families had participated in his murder and burial, just as they had with all the others. I immediately contacted the FBI and the Minnesota State Police to report what we had discovered. Within hours, both farms were swarming with federal agents and forensic investigators. The entire disputed strip was excavated, revealing a total of 14 bodies spanning nearly 60 years of criminal activity. Both families were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The investigation revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated in the area for decades, with both families working together to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The irony of the situation was that the property dispute that had brought me there in the first place had never been real. Both families had manufactured the boundary disagreement as a way to keep attention focused on the legal aspects of the land ownership rather than on what was actually buried there. My work as a land surveyor usually involves helping people resolve legitimate disputes over property boundaries and ownership rights. But in this case, I had been unknowingly hired to help two criminal families maintain control over their burial ground. The experience taught me that in rural communities, even the most ordinary-seeming property disputes can have dark underlying causes. Long-running conflicts between neighboring families sometimes involve much more than just disagreements over fence lines or drainage ditches. Since the Hartwell-Lindbergh case, I have been much more careful about accepting boundary dispute cases, especially ones involving families that have been in conflict for decades. I always conduct thorough background research on my clients and the properties involved, and I don't hesitate to contact law enforcement if I discover anything suspicious during my survey work. The disputed strip of land is now part of an ongoing federal investigation, and both farms have been seized as evidence in the criminal case. The families who hired me to resolve their property dispute are now serving life sentences in federal prison. Sometimes the boundaries that people fight over aren't just about land ownership. Sometimes they're about protecting secrets that are buried beneath the surface. Emergency dispatch gets weird calls during blizzards, but the call that came in during the January 2023 storm wasn't about being snowed in or power outages. Martha Olson from Township Road 15 was calling because her weather radio was broadcasting forecasts for places that don't exist, and the voice giving the reports belonged to her husband, who'd been dead for 6 years. I had been working as an emergency services dispatcher for McLean County for about 8 years when that call came in. Most of my experience was with typical rural emergencies, farm accidents, medical calls to isolated homes, and the occasional search and rescue when someone got lost during hunting season. Winter storms always brought their own set of challenges, mostly power outages and people getting stranded on back roads, but nothing that prepared me for what Martha Olson reported that night. The January 2023 blizzard was one of the worst storms to hit central North Dakota in decades. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, and snowfall so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. We had been fielding emergency calls for 3 straight days, mostly from people whose furnaces had failed or who needed medical assistance but couldn't get to the hospital due to impassable roads. Martha's call came in around 2 in the morning on the 3rd night of the storm. I recognized her voice immediately because she had called dispatch several times over the years, usually for minor medical issues related to her diabetes or to report suspicious vehicles on the rural roads near her farm. She was a reliable caller, the kind of person who only contacted emergency services when she genuinely needed help. But this call was different from anything I had ever received. Martha sounded frightened and confused, and she kept apologizing for bothering us during the storm. She explained that she had been listening to her weather radio to track the progress of the blizzard when it started broadcasting forecasts for locations that she had never heard of. Places with names like Coldwater Junction and White Rock Township and Millerville Crossing. At first, I assumed that her radio was picking up transmissions from a different state or maybe even Canada, which sometimes happened during severe weather when atmospheric conditions could cause radio signals to travel much farther than normal. I was about to explain this to Martha when she told me the part that made my blood run cold. Martha said that the voice giving the weather forecasts sounded exactly like her husband Harold, who had died of a heart attack in 2017. She insisted that it wasn't just a similar voice or someone who reminded her of Harold. She was absolutely certain that it was Harold's voice, complete with his distinctive accent and the way he pronounced certain words. I had met Harold Olson several times during my years as a dispatcher. He had been a volunteer with our emergency response team, helping with search and rescue operations and severe weather spotting. He had a very distinctive way of speaking with a slight Norwegian accent that reflected his family's heritage, and he always ended his radio transmissions with the phrase 73 and stay safe, which was ham radio code for best wishes. Martha told me that the voice on her weather radio was using Harold's exact speech patterns, and even ending each forecast with 73 and stay safe. She had been listening to the broadcasts for over an hour, and each forecast was for a different fictional location, but they were all delivered in Harold's unmistakable voice. I tried to calm Martha down and suggested that the storm might be causing her radio to malfunction or pick up unusual signals. But she insisted that the radio was working perfectly and that the forecasts were clear and detailed, just like regular National Weather Service broadcasts. She offered to hold the phone up to the radio so I could hear the transmissions myself. When Martha held her phone near the weather radio, I could clearly hear a male voice giving detailed weather forecasts. The voice was professional and authoritative, just like a trained meteorologist, but it was also somehow familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. The forecast was for a place called Deadwood Prairie, predicting continued blizzard conditions with wind gusts up to 80 miles per hour and snowfall accumulations of 18 to 24 inches. What made the broadcast truly disturbing was that it ended with the phrase 73 and stay safe, delivered in the exact tone and cadence that I remembered from Harold Olson's emergency radio transmissions. I had heard Harold use that sign-off dozens of times during my years as a dispatcher, and there was no mistaking his distinctive way of saying it. I told Martha that I would send a deputy to check on her as soon as the roads were passable, but she said that wasn't necessary. She just wanted someone to know what was happening in case something went wrong. She also asked me if I could check our records to see if there had ever been places called Coldwater Junction or White Rock Township in McLean County, because the weather reports were describing local landmarks and road conditions that seemed familiar even though the town names were completely unknown to her. After I finished the call with Martha, I spent the rest of my shift researching the place names that she had mentioned. I checked historical maps, county records, and even old telephone directories, but I couldn't find any reference to Coldwater Junction, White Rock Township, Millerville Crossing, or any of the other locations that had been mentioned in the weather forecasts. However, I did discover something that made the situation even more unsettling. When I looked at modern maps of McLean County and the surrounding area, I noticed that many of the geographic features mentioned in the fictional weather forecasts actually existed. There really was a Deadwood Prairie, though it was just an unnamed section of grassland about 20 miles north of Martha's farm. There were also several creeks, hills, and other landmarks that had been accurately described in the mysterious broadcasts. It was as if someone with detailed knowledge of the local geography was creating fictional towns and townships in real locations, then broadcasting weather forecasts for these imaginary communities using Harold Olson's voice and speech patterns. 2 days later, when the storm finally passed and the roads were cleared, I drove out to Martha's farm to check on her and to listen to her weather radio myself. Martha was relieved to see me, and she explained that the strange broadcasts had continued throughout the entire storm, always featuring different fictional locations, but always delivered in Harold's distinctive voice. She led me to her kitchen where she kept the weather radio, a standard National Weather Service receiver that was tuned to the local emergency broadcast frequency. When she turned it on, we could hear normal weather updates from the Bismarck office, with current conditions and forecasts for real cities and counties in the region. But Martha said that the mysterious broadcasts only occurred during severe weather events and only late at night when most people would be asleep. She had been keeping a log of all the fictional place names and weather conditions that had been reported, and she showed me pages of notes written in her careful handwriting. The locations mentioned in the broadcasts formed a pattern that was both fascinating and disturbing. All of the fictional towns and townships were located in areas where real communities had existed decades earlier, but had been abandoned due to economic hardship or natural disasters. Coldwater Junction had been built on the site of a railroad town that was abandoned in the 1930s. White Rock Township corresponded to an area where several farming families had lived until the Dust Bowl forced them to relocate. It was as if the mysterious broadcaster was creating weather forecasts for ghost towns, communities that had once existed but were now just empty fields and forgotten foundations. And the person delivering these forecasts was using the voice of Harold Olson, a man who had spent his entire life in McLean County and would have known the history of every abandoned settlement in the area. Martha also told me something that she hadn't mentioned during her emergency call. She said that the weather forecasts weren't just describing current conditions. They were also including historical information about the fictional communities, mentioning families who had lived there, businesses that had operated, and events that had supposedly taken place decades earlier. Some of these historical details matched real information about the abandoned settlements that had once existed in those locations. The broadcasts would mention family names that appeared in old county records, or describe businesses that had actually operated in the ghost towns before they were abandoned. I contacted the National Weather Service office in Bismarck to report the unusual radio transmissions, but they had no record of any unauthorized broadcasts on their frequency. They suggested that Martha's radio might be malfunctioning or that she might be picking up transmissions from amateur radio operators who were using their equipment inappropriately. But I knew that wasn't the explanation. I had heard Harold Olson's voice too many times to mistake it for someone else, and the level of historical detail in the broadcasts suggested access to information that would be difficult for a prankster to obtain. Over the next year, Martha continued to receive the mysterious weather forecasts during severe storms. She called me several times to report new fictional locations and to share additional historical information that had been included in the broadcasts. Each time I verified that the places didn't exist on modern maps, but corresponded to areas where real communities had once thrived. The most disturbing call came in December 2023, almost a year after the first incident. Martha reported that the weather radio had broadcast a forecast for Olson's Corners, a fictional township located exactly where Harold Olson's family farm had been before it was sold after his death. The forecast had included detailed information about the Olson family history, mentioning Harold's parents and grandparents by name and describing events that had taken place on the farm over the past century. The broadcast had ended with Harold's voice saying, "This is your final forecast for Olson's Corners. The weather ahead is clear and calm. 73 and stay safe, Martha." Martha never received another mysterious weather broadcast after that night. Her radio returned to normal operation, receiving only official National Weather Service transmissions. But she told me that she still turns on the weather radio during every storm, hoping to hear Harold's voice one more time, delivering forecasts for places that exist only in memory and in the voices of the dead who refuse to let them be forgotten.